The wheel shattered at the worst possible moment, alone, miles from anywhere, with darkness closing in. Clara Dawson had heard the whispers her whole life. Too smart, too stubborn, too independent to ever be a wife. She'd made peace with loneliness. But when a tall stranger emerged from the dust of Cottonwood Creek, offering help with eyes that held storms and secrets, everything changed. This is the story of a broken wheel, a quiet cowboy, and the forever that nobody thought possible. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun was dying over Cottonwood Creek, bleeding crimson and gold across the Colorado Territory sky, when Clara Dawson's life changed forever. She just didn't know it yet. The crack came first, sharp as a gunshot, violent enough to make her mare whinny and sidestep. Then the lurch, the sickening drop of the left side of her wagon as wood splintered and the wheel gave way completely. Clara grabbed the seat rail with both hands, her heart hammering as the wagon tilted at a dangerous angle, books and supplies sliding across the bed with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the empty prairie. "Whoa! Easy, Rosie, easy, girl," Clara called out, keeping her voice steady even as panic fluttered in her chest. The mare settled, sides heaving, and Clara carefully climbed down from the crippled wagon to assess the damage. It was worse than she'd feared. The wheel hadn't just cracked, it had shattered, spokes jutting out like broken bones. The iron rim twisted beyond any repair she could manage on her own. Clara pushed a loose strand of dark hair from her face and looked around at the empty landscape stretching in every direction. Rolling prairie grass painted amber by the setting sun, a few scraggly cottonwoods along a distant creek bed. No ranch houses, no other travelers, nothing but wind and sky, and the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd left Silverton that morning, determined to make the journey to Juniper Springs on her own, despite everyone's warnings. A woman alone shouldn't travel these roads, they'd said. Not safe for someone like you, Miss Dawson. She could still hear the disapproval in Mrs. Henderson's voice, the way the older woman had pursed her lips when Clara announced she'd accepted the teaching position in Juniper Springs and would be making the journey herself. But Clara had been defying Mrs. Henderson and people like her for most of her 26 years. Being born a woman with a mind that hungered for knowledge and a voice that refused to stay silent had made her an oddity in most circles. The schoolteacher who never married. Too educated for her own good, they whispered. Too opinionated. Too independent. A spinster before 30, mark my words. Clara had learned to wear their judgment like armor. She'd made peace with loneliness, told herself that solitude was better than settling, that a life of teaching and books and independence was enough. It had to be enough, because no man had ever looked at her with anything but wariness or fleeting curiosity that faded the moment she expressed an opinion or mentioned the 3 years she'd spent at the women's college in Denver. Now standing beside her broken wagon as shadows lengthened across the prairie, Clara felt that armor crack just a little. She was still 15 miles from Juniper Springs, maybe more. The sun would be down within the hour, and the temperature was already dropping. She had blankets in the wagon, provisions enough for several days, but the thought of spending the night out here alone, exposed to whatever might be wandering these plains after dark, wolves, outlaws, worse, made her stomach knot with fear she refused to name. "Well," she said aloud to Rosie, who flicked an ear back at the sound of her voice, "standing here feeling sorry for ourselves won't fix anything, will it, girl?" She began unhitching the mare, figuring she could at least gather what supplies she could carry and start walking. Maybe she'd find a ranch house before full dark, or another traveler on the road. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than simply waiting for rescue that might never come. Clara had just finished securing Rosie's bridle when the sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Her hand instinctively went to the small pistol she kept in her pocket, a gift from her father before he died. One of the few practical things he'd ever given her besides his love of learning. She drew it out, keeping it low by her side as she turned toward the sound. A single rider was approaching from the east, silhouetted against the dying light so she couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a man on a tall horse moving at an easy lope. Clara's heart pounded as the rider drew closer. Out here, alone, a woman had to be cautious. Stories of what happened to unprotected travelers were common currency in towns across the territory. The rider slowed his horse to a walk as he approached, and Clara tightened her grip on the pistol, though she kept it partially hidden in the folds of her skirt. As he came within 30 feet, she could finally make out details. A tall man in dusty range clothes, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn hat pulled low. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Evening, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. He reined his horse to a stop at a respectful distance, making no move to dismount. "Looks like you've run into some trouble." Clara studied him carefully, trying to assess the threat. His hands were visible on the reins, nowhere near the gun belt she could see strapped around his hips. His posture was relaxed but not careless, and there was something in his voice, a genuine concern without any hint of the predatory interest she'd learned to recognize and fear. "My wheel broke," she said, keeping her voice level and confident even as she remained alert for any wrong move. "About an hour ago." The rider nudged his horse a few steps closer, then stopped again when he noticed the slight shift in Clara's stance. He raised one hand slowly, palm out in a gesture of peace. "I mean, no harm, ma'am. Just saw you from the ridge yonder and thought you might need assistance." He tilted his head slightly, and she could see his face better now in the fading light. Strong features, weathered by sun and wind, a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and eyes. Even at this distance, she could see they were light-colored, watching her with a directness that was somehow more assessing than aggressive. "I appreciate the concern," Clara replied carefully, "but I can manage." "Can you?" There was no mockery in the question, just honest curiosity. The rider shifted his gaze to the broken wheel, then back to her face. "That's going to take more than managing, I'm afraid. Wheels destroyed. You'd need a blacksmith and a carpenter both to make it right, and the nearest town with either is Juniper Springs, which I'm guessing is where you were headed." Clara felt her defenses bristle at his presumption, even though he was right. "And how would you know where I was headed?" "Only town of any size in this direction," he said simply. "Plus you've got the look of a school teacher, if you don't mind my saying. Books in the wagon bed, practical dress, no wedding ring, but dressed too respectable to be anything but educated and employed. Juniper Springs has been looking for a new teacher since Miss Abernathy retired last spring. Doesn't take much to put it together." Despite herself, Clara felt a flicker of interest. He was observant, this stranger, and he spoke with an easy intelligence that surprised her. Most cowboys she'd met were good men, but not particularly given to deduction or conversation beyond weather and cattle prices. "You're right on all counts," she admitted, relaxing her stance just slightly, though she kept the pistol ready. "I'm Clara Dawson, the new teacher for Juniper Springs." "And you would be?" "Eli Forrester." He touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of respect. "I run a ranch about 3 miles east of here, along Forrester Creek. It's not much, small operation, just me and a couple of hands and my cook Hattie, but it's honest work and we've got a spare room if you need a place to stay until we can get you and your wagon to town." Clara weighed the offer, searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. Accepting help from a strange man, going to his ranch. It went against every cautious instinct she'd developed, but the alternative was spending the night out here alone, and the sun was nearly down now, the temperature dropping fast. She looked at Eli Forrester again, really looked at him, and found herself wanting to trust the steadiness she saw there. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Forrester," she said slowly. "But you must understand my hesitation. I don't know you, and I'd be a fool to ride off with a stranger without some assurance of my safety." Eli nodded, as if he'd expected exactly that response and respected her for it. "You would be a fool, and I don't take you for one, Miss Dawson." He thought for a moment, then said, "My cook Hattie Simmons, she's been with me 5 years, and before that she worked at the hotel in Silverton. If you're from that direction, you might know her, or know of her. She's got family there, the Simmons clan. Her brother runs the general store." Clara's eyebrows rose. She did know the Simmons family. Everyone in Silverton did. Tom Simmons was one of the most respected merchants in town, and she'd heard he had a sister who'd gone to work as a ranch cook somewhere east. "I know Tom Simmons," she said carefully. "Good man, honest." "Runs in the family," Eli said. "Hattie's as honest as they come, and she's tough as nails. If you've got concerns about propriety or safety, she'll be there, and she doesn't stand for nonsense from anyone, including me." He paused, then added, "You're welcome to keep that pistol handy the whole ride if it makes you feel safer. I won't take offense." The fact that he'd noticed the gun and wasn't troubled by it actually made Clara feel better. She made a decision, hoping it was the right one. "All right, Mr. Forrester, I'll accept your offer with gratitude, but I will keep my pistol close, and if I sense any reason to doubt your word, I won't hesitate to use it." Eli smiled, a small, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of those storm-gray eyes. Wouldn't expect anything less from a woman smart enough to become a teacher. "Now, let's see about securing your supplies and getting you to somewhere warm before we both freeze." He dismounted then, and Clara got her first good look at him standing. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, no wasted effort, as he approached the wagon and began assessing what could be salvaged. "We can load what's most valuable on my horse," he said, running a hand over the broken wheel with a practiced eye. "I'll come back tomorrow with a wagon to fetch the rest and haul this one to the blacksmith in town. He'll need to build you a new wheel entirely, but he's good at his work. Take a few days, though." Clara began pulling out the items she couldn't bear to leave behind, her books mainly, and her personal belongings. Eli helped without being asked, handling her things with a care that surprised her. When he lifted the crate of books, he paused, reading the spines. "Shakespeare, Dickens, Emerson," he murmured. "And that's Leaves of Grass? Whitman? You know Whitman?" Clara couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Eli glanced up at her, and there was something in his expression, a brief flash of pain or memory, quickly shuddered. "I know Whitman. I celebrate myself and sing myself. My what?" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Someone I knew once loved that collection." Clara wanted to ask about the someone, about the shadow that had crossed his face, but something held her back. Instead, she simply said, "It's a beautiful work. Controversial, but beautiful." "The best things usually are," Eli replied quietly, and carefully placed the books in his saddlebags. They worked in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, packing what they could onto his horse and securing Rosie's lead rope. When everything was ready, Eli helped Clara mount Rosie, then swung easily onto his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood calmly despite the added weight of supplies. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch," Eli said, turning his horse east. "Stay close, and if you see or hear anything that concerns you, call out. Wolves sometimes hunt in these parts after dark, and while they usually avoid people, better safe than sorry." Clara nodded, checking that her pistol was still in easy reach, and they set off across the darkening prairie. The ride to Forester Creek Ranch passed in a strange mixture of wariness and wonder. Clara kept alert, watching the shadows and listening to the night sounds of the plains, but she couldn't help being aware of Eli Forrester riding just ahead of her. He moved with his horse like they were one creature, and occasionally he'd glance back to check on her, a silent question in that brief look that she'd answer with a nod. They didn't talk much during the ride, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Clara found herself oddly at ease despite the circumstances, despite the fact that she was riding through darkness with a man she'd known for less than 2 hours. There was something about him, a quietness that felt like strength rather than absence, a steadiness that her instincts said she could trust. When the lights of the ranch house finally appeared in the distance, Clara felt a rush of relief. The ranch was modest, as Eli had said. A main house, a barn, a few outbuildings clustered near a line of trees that marked the creek. But even in the darkness, it looked solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. As they approached, the front door opened and a woman appeared, backlit by the light from inside. She was large and formidable looking, with her hands on her hips and a stance that suggested she could handle whatever trouble came her way. "Eli Forrester, where have you been?" the woman called out. "Supper's been waiting an hour, and—" She stopped as she caught sight of Clara. "Well now, who's this?" "Hattie, this is Miss Clara Dawson, the new teacher for Juniper Springs," Eli said as they rode into the yard. "Had some trouble on the road, broken wheel. I offered her hospitality for the night until we can get her and her wagon sorted out." Hattie's expression shifted immediately from irritation to concern and welcome. She hurried down the porch steps as Eli dismounted and moved to help Clara down from Rosie. "Broken wheel? Out on that road alone? Lord have mercy, child, you must be half frozen and scared to death," Hattie said, taking Clara's hands in her own work-roughened ones. Come on inside right now. We'll get you warm and fed. Eli, you see to those horses, and don't you dare track mud in my kitchen when you come in." "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, and Clara thought she detected a hint of amusement in his voice. Hattie ushered Clara into the ranch house, and the warmth hit her like a physical thing. The interior was simple but comfortable. Wooden floors worn smooth by years of use, sturdy furniture that looked handmade. And everywhere Clara looked, evidence of a life being lived. A book lay open on a side table. A half-finished mending project sat in a basket by the fireplace. The smell of something delicious, stew, Clara thought, filled the air and made her stomach growl. "You poor thing," Hattie said, guiding Clara to a chair near the fire. "Let me get you some coffee, and then we'll get some hot food in you. Don't you worry about a thing. You're safe here, and I don't care what anyone might say about propriety. A woman alone in trouble deserves help. Full stop." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness, and she blinked them back, not wanting to appear weak. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. Your brother Tom speaks very highly of you." Hattie's face lit up. "You know my Tom? Well, isn't that something? Any friend of Tom's is family here. Now you sit tight while I get that coffee." She bustled off to the kitchen, leaving Clara alone for a moment to take in her surroundings more carefully. The room was neat but lived in, with the kind of comfort that came from someone actually caring about making a house a home. Her eyes traveled over the bookcases, and there were several, she noted with interest, packed with volumes that ranged from agricultural journals to what looked like classic literature. On the mantel above the fireplace, she noticed a daguerreotype in a simple frame, a young woman, pretty and delicate-looking, holding a baby. Even in the sepia tones of the photograph, Clara could see the joy in the woman's face, the way she looked at the camera, or more likely, at whoever was taking the picture, with complete trust and love. "Here we are," Hattie said, returning with a steaming mug of coffee that Clara accepted gratefully. The older woman's eyes followed Clara's gaze to the photograph, and her expression softened with sadness. "That's Sarah and little Emma, Eli's wife and daughter. Lost them both to fever 4 years back." Clara's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "We all were," Hattie replied, settling into a chair across from Clara. "Near broke him losing them like that. He was away on a cattle drive, didn't even get to say goodbye. When he came back and found them already buried," she shook her head. "Thought we'd lose him too, in a different way. He went dark for a long time, just working himself near to death, barely speaking. But slowly, he came back to the living. Built this ranch up from almost nothing, poured all his grief into making something good. He's a fine man, Miss Dawson, one of the best I've known." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and sipped her coffee, letting its warmth spread through her cold body. She understood grief. She'd lost her parents young, knew what it was to carry that weight. But to lose a wife and child, to come home to that emptiness, she couldn't imagine. The door opened and Eli came in, having removed his boots and coat outside. His hair was damp from where he'd washed up at the pump, and in the better light of the house, Clara could see him more clearly. He looked tired, she thought, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun and longer nights of perhaps not enough sleep. But there was strength in his face, too, and a quiet dignity that she found herself admiring. "Horses are settled," he said to Hattie. "I put Miss Dawson's mare in the spare stall, gave her extra grain. She's a good animal." "Her name is Rosie," Clara offered. "She was my father's horse originally, one of the few things I have left of him." Eli's eyes met hers, and there was understanding there. "I'll take good care of her," he said simply. "Now sit down, both of you, and let's eat before everything gets cold," Hattie ordered, heading back to the kitchen. "Miss Dawson, I hope you like beef stew because that's what we have, and there's no arguing with my menu." Clara found herself smiling, actually smiling, despite the disaster of her day. "Beef stew sounds like heaven right now, Mrs. Simmons." "Call me Hattie, dear. Everyone does." They sat down to dinner at a simple wooden table in the kitchen, more intimate than a formal dining room, and somehow Clara appreciated that. The food was indeed delicious, hearty, and well-seasoned, and Clara realized she was hungrier than she'd thought. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of ladylike manners, but Hattie waved off her concerns. "You eat your fill, child. No standing on ceremony here. Eli, pass her the bread." As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than Clara would have expected. Hattie asked about her background, her education, what had brought her to Colorado Territory. Clara found herself talking more freely than she had in months, perhaps because both Hattie and Eli seemed genuinely interested rather than politely tolerant. "My father was a teacher," Clara explained. "He believed education was the key to everything: freedom, prosperity, progress. He made sure I had the best schooling he could provide, even sent me to college in Denver despite what everyone in our town said about it being a waste for a girl." "Nothing wasted about education," Eli said quietly. It was one of the few times he'd spoken during the meal, and something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. "You sound like you speak from experience," she ventured. Eli was quiet for a moment, running his thumb along the rim of his coffee cup. "My wife, Sarah, she was educated too, went to a finishing school back east before her family moved west. She had more books than I'd ever seen in one place, and she'd read them all, some of them multiple times." He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "She used to read to me in the evenings, after work was done. Poetry mostly. Said it reminded her that there was beauty in the world beyond the hard work of ranching. She taught him to appreciate literature," Hattie added gently. Before Sarah, Eli had never read much beyond agricultural journals. She opened up whole new worlds for him. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of this quiet cowboy. He wasn't just being polite about her education. He genuinely valued it, understood its importance in a way that most men in her experience simply didn't. "What happened to her books?" Clara asked softly. "They're here," Eli said, gesturing toward the other room. "In those bookcases you were looking at. I couldn't bear to part with them. Sometimes I still read them, hear her voice in the words." He cleared his throat, as if embarrassed by revealing so much. "I'm sorry. That's probably more than you wanted to know." "No," Clara said quickly. "No, I think it's beautiful that you kept them, that you still read them." Their eyes met across the table, and Clara felt something pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. They were both people who'd loved and lost, who'd found solace in books and ideas, who didn't quite fit the simple molds their world tried to press them into. Hattie, watching this exchange with interest, stood abruptly. "Well now, I think Miss Dawson is about to fall asleep in her stew, and I've got early baking to do tomorrow. Eli, you show her to the spare room while I clean up here." "I can help with the dishes," Clara protested, but Hattie waved her off. "Absolutely not. You're a guest and you've had a trying day. Go on now, get yourself to bed. Everything will look better in the morning. It always does." Eli led Clara through the house to a small but comfortable bedroom. The bed was already made with clean sheets, and there was a pitcher of water on the washstand, towels neatly folded beside it. "I brought your personal bag in," Eli said, indicating the carpet bag sitting on a chair. "Your books and other supplies are still in the barn, but they'll be safe there until we can get you to town." "Thank you," Clara said, "for everything. I know I was suspicious when you first offered help, but you had every right to be," Eli interrupted gently. "A woman alone has to be careful. I'm glad you were. It shows good sense." He started to leave, then paused at the door. "Miss Dawson, I'm glad you trusted me enough to come here. Not everyone would have." "I'm glad I did too, Mr. Forrester," Claire replied honestly. After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Claire changed into her nightgown and crawled into bed. The sheets smelled of lavender and sunshine, and the mattress was far more comfortable than she'd expected. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch settling for the night, she thought about the strange turn her day had taken. She'd left Silverton that morning expecting a simple if solitary journey to her new life. Instead, her wagon had broken, and she'd met a cowboy with sad eyes and a love for poetry. A man who'd built a ranch from grief and still read the books his dead wife had loved. A man who'd noticed she was educated and found it admirable rather than threatening. Clara had resigned herself to loneliness years ago, accepted that her intelligence and independence would keep her apart from the kind of connection other women seemed to find so easily. But lying there in that borrowed bed, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that felt dangerous and hopeful all at once. She told herself firmly not to be foolish. One evening of kindness didn't mean anything. Eli Forrester was simply a decent man helping someone in trouble. Tomorrow, they'd get her wagon fixed, and she'd go on to Juniper Springs, and that would be the end of it. But as she drifted off to sleep, Clara couldn't quite convince herself that she wanted that to be the end, and that scared her more than the broken wheel or the lonely prairie ever had. In the main room of the ranch house, Eli sat alone by the dying fire, Sarah's copy of Leaves of Grass open in his hands, though he wasn't really reading. He was thinking about the schoolteacher sleeping in his spare room, about the intelligence in her dark eyes, and the wariness in her stance that he recognized because he'd worn it himself for years after Sarah died. He'd expected to spend the rest of his life alone, had accepted it, even embraced it as fitting after losing everything he'd loved. Building the ranch had been enough purpose, and Hattie's company and the work had been enough to fill his days. But something about Clara Dawson had reached through that self-imposed isolation and made him feel things he'd thought were dead with Sarah. The way she'd stood beside that broken wagon, pistol hidden but ready, refusing to be a helpless victim. The way her face had lit up when he mentioned Whitman. The way she'd looked at Sarah's photograph with compassion rather than awkwardness or pity. Eli closed the book and stared into the fire. He was being ridiculous. She was here for one night out of necessity, nothing more. Come morning, they'd make arrangements to get her to town, and she'd start her new life as Juniper Springs schoolteacher. Their paths had crossed by accident, and that's all it was. But as he finally stood to go to his own bed, Eli couldn't quite shake the feeling that this particular accident might turn out to be something more like fate. And he wasn't sure whether that thought terrified or thrilled him more. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and in a small ranch house on Forester Creek, two lonely people slept and dreamed of things they'd both convinced themselves were impossible. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new decisions, and the beginning of something neither of them were quite prepared for. But tonight, for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them were quite so alone. Clara woke to the smell of fresh coffee and baking bread, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room. Sunlight streamed through the simple curtains, and for a brief moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory flooded back, the broken wheel, the stranger on horseback, the ranch house with its warm kitchen and sad-eyed cowboy who read poetry. She dressed quickly in a practical navy dress, pinned her dark hair into a neat bun, and made her way toward the kitchen, following the sound of Hattie's humming and the irresistible aroma of breakfast. The older woman looked up from the stove with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Well, good morning. You look considerably better than you did last night, child. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks, actually," Clara admitted, surprised by the truth of it. "Thank you again for your hospitality, Hattie. I hope I haven't been too much trouble." "Nonsense. It's nice having another woman in the house for a change. Gets tiresome being surrounded by ranch hands who think conversation means grunting at each other about cattle." Hattie poured Clara a cup of coffee and gestured to the table. "Sit, sit. Breakfast will be ready in just a minute. Eli's out in the barn already. Man works harder than any 3 people I know, but he'll be in soon enough." Clara sat, wrapping her hands around the warm mug and watching Hattie work. There was something deeply comforting about the older woman's presence, a maternal quality that Clara had missed since her own mother's death years ago. Without quite meaning to, she found herself asking, "Hattie, last night you mentioned that Eli built this ranch after he lost his family. Was he a rancher before?" Hattie glanced over her shoulder, assessing Clara with sharp eyes that missed nothing. After a moment, she seemed to come to some decision. "No, he wasn't. Eli Forrester came from back east originally, Massachusetts, I think, though he doesn't talk much about it. Met Sarah at a church social when her family first moved to Colorado. She was refined, educated, everything proper, and he fell for her like a stone dropped in a well." Hattie smiled at the memory. "They married quick, and he took work as a ranch hand to support them, learned the trade from the ground up. Good with his hands, good with animals, and smart enough to see how things could be done better." She flipped pancakes onto a platter with practiced efficiency. "They had little Emma about a year after they married. Prettiest baby you ever saw, with her mama's blue eyes and her daddy's dark hair. They were happy, Miss Dawson. Really, truly happy, in that way that makes other folks believe in love again just by watching them." Clara's chest tightened. "What happened?" "Scarlet fever swept through the territory that winter. Eli had signed on for a big cattle drive, needed the money, as they were saving to buy their own land. He was gone near 3 months. Sarah took sick first, then Emma caught it from her. By the time word reached Eli and he rode back, well, they'd already been in the ground 2 weeks. Hattie's voice went soft. Sarah's parents, they meant well, but they couldn't handle their grief. They buried their daughter and granddaughter and left Colorado within the month, went back east where they came from. And Eli stayed, Clara said quietly. Eli stayed, took every penny he'd saved, every cent he'd earned on that drive, and bought this land. Worked himself near to death that first year, building the house, the barn, fencing the property. My brother Tom was worried about him. They'd become friends, you see. So Tom asked me to come out here and cook for Eli, make sure he was eating, wasn't drinking himself to death or worse. Hattie began setting plates on the table. I came for what I thought would be a few months, and here I am 5 years later. This place became home, and watching Eli slowly heal, slowly come back to life, well, that became important to me. Before Clara could respond, the door opened and Eli himself came in, bringing a gust of cool morning air with him. He'd already washed at the pump outside, his hair still damp and his face freshly shaved. He looked younger in the morning light, and Clara noticed details she'd missed in last night's darkness. The slight cleft in his chin, the way his mouth curved naturally upward at one corner, as if he were perpetually on the verge of a small smile. "Morning, Miss Dawson," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Hope you slept well. Hattie, something smells incredible as always." "Flattery will get you extra pancakes," Hattie said dryly. "Now both of you sit down and eat before everything gets cold. I won't have my breakfast unappreciated." They settled around the table, and for a few minutes there was comfortable silence as they ate. Clara found herself stealing glances at Eli, noticing the way he moved, economical, precise, nothing wasted. He caught her looking once and their eyes met, and Clara quickly looked away, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I was thinking," Eli said after a while, setting down his fork, "about the best way to handle your situation, Miss Dawson. Your wagon's going to need at least 3 days of work once we get it to town. New wheel built from scratch, plus some other repairs I noticed on the axle. And you'll need somewhere to stay in Juniper Springs while that's being done." "I was planning to stay at the hotel," Clara said. "It's not ideal financially, but I assumed the school would have teachers' quarters ready." Eli and Hattie exchanged a look that made Clara's stomach sink. "What is it?" she asked. "Well," Eli said carefully, "the thing is, Juniper Springs is in the middle of some growing pains. They're building new teachers' quarters, but from what I heard last time I was in town, they're not finished yet. Won't be ready for another month at least." "A month?" Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. "But I start teaching in 2 weeks. The school board's letter said the quarters would be ready when I arrived." The school board's letter was written by Harvey Hutchins, who owns the lumber mill and couldn't organize a 2-horse parade without causing a stampede, Hattie said bluntly. "He means well, but he's about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. I'd bet my best skillet he never actually checked with the builders before he wrote that letter." Clara felt panic rising in her chest. She'd budgeted carefully for this move, and a month in a hotel would eat through her modest savings faster than she could afford. But more than that, she felt the familiar weight of disappointment. One more promise broken, one more plan that didn't work out the way it was supposed to. "I'll figure something out," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps I can find a boarding house, or—" "Stay here," Eli said. The words hung in the air between them. Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "Stay here at the ranch," Eli repeated, his gray eyes steady on hers. "Just until the teachers' quarters are ready and your wagon's repaired. We have the room, and Hattie's here for propriety. You'd be helping us out, actually. Hattie's been after me to hire someone to help catalog Sarah's books, and you'd be perfect for it. We could call it employment, pay you a fair wage for the work. That way you'd have income while you wait, and a place to stay that won't cost you anything." "Eli Forrester, when did you get so clever?" Hattie said approvingly. "That's actually a fine plan. Those books do need organizing. They're in complete disarray, and Miss Dawson here obviously knows her way around a library." Clara's mind raced. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. She barely knew these people, and accepting such hospitality felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Yet the practical part of her brain was already calculating. A month's wages instead of a month's hotel bills would make a significant difference to her financial situation. "I couldn't impose on you like that," she started, but Eli shook his head. "It's not an imposition if you're working, and honestly, Miss Dawson, those books have been weighing on my mind. Sarah would have wanted them properly cared for, but I don't have the knowledge to do it right. You'd be doing me a service." There was something in his voice when he spoke of Sarah, a tenderness mixed with old pain, that made Clara's throat tighten. She thought about the photograph on the mantel, the young woman with joy in her eyes, and found herself wanting to honor that woman's memory by caring for the things she'd loved. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an inconvenience," Clara said slowly, "then I accept, with gratitude. But I insist on earning my keep beyond just the bookwork. I can help Hattie with cooking and cleaning, and—" "We'll work out the details," Hattie interrupted, beaming. "But yes, dear, you can help me. Lord knows I could use an extra pair of hands around here, and it'll be nice having female company for a change." Eli stood, picking up his hat. "Then it's settled. I'll ride into town this morning, arrange for your wagon to be picked up and taken to the blacksmith. I'll also stop by the school board office and let them know you've arrived and will be available to start teaching as soon as the quarters are ready. And I'll speak to your cousin Martha. She runs the boarding house on Main Street, doesn't she?" "She does," Clara confirmed, surprised that he knew this detail. "Martha Pruitt. How did you—" "Small territory," Eli said with that almost smile. "Word gets around. I'll let her know you're safe and where you're staying, so she doesn't worry." After Eli left, Clara helped Hattie clear the breakfast dishes, and the older woman wasted no time getting down to brass tacks. "Now, before you go thinking anything improper about this arrangement," Hattie said, plunging her hands into the dishwater, "I want you to know that Eli Forrester is as honorable as they come. He's not making this offer because he has any designs on you, though Lord knows it wouldn't be the worst thing if he did. You're a lovely young woman, and he's been alone too long. But because he genuinely wants to help. That's just who he is." "I understand," Clara said, picking up a towel to dry. "And I appreciate the reassurance, Hattie. Though I have to say, I'm not worried about Mr. Forrester's intentions. There was something about him last night. Even when I first met him on the road, I felt safe. Which is odd, because I'm usually quite suspicious of people's motives." "That's because you've probably dealt with men who feel threatened by an educated woman," Hattie said shrewdly. "Eli's not like that. Sarah taught him to appreciate intelligence in women, and more than that, she taught him that a true partnership means respecting your partner's mind as much as anything else." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then Hattie said, "Can I give you some advice, Miss Dawson? Woman to woman?" "Of course." "Don't close yourself off to possibilities just because you've been disappointed before. I saw the way you looked at him this morning, and I saw the way he looked at you last night when you were talking about books and education. There's something there, something worth paying attention to. I'm not saying rush into anything. Lord knows both of you have wounds that need respecting, but don't let fear make you blind to what might be right in front of you." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "Hattie, I'm here for one reason, to teach. I've made peace with the fact that marriage isn't in my future. Men don't want wives who are smarter than them or who have opinions about things beyond household management. Some men don't," Hattie agreed, "but some men do. And you might just be standing in the kitchen of one of them right now." Before Clara could respond to that, Hattie changed the subject, asking about Clara's teaching plans and what books she'd be using for her students. But the words lingered in Clara's mind as they finished the dishes, and Hattie showed her to the room where Sarah's books were kept. It was a small study off the main living area, lined with shelves that were indeed in complete disarray. Books were stacked horizontally and vertically with no apparent system, some lying open as if someone had set them down mid-reading and never returned, others with slips of paper marking pages. Clara ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles that ranged from philosophy to poetry, from scientific treatises to romantic novels. "Sarah read everything," Hattie said from the doorway. "Didn't matter the subject. If it was in print, she wanted to know about it. Eli said sometimes she'd have 3 or 4 books going at once, jumping between them depending on her mood." Clara pulled out a volume of Wordsworth and opened it carefully. On the inside cover, in delicate feminine script, was written, "To my darling Eli, who sees poetry in every sunrise, may we share 1,000 more together, your Sarah." The inscription was dated 5 years ago, just months before Sarah and Emma had died. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and quickly blinked them back. She carefully replaced the book and turned to Hattie. "I'll take good care of these," she said softly. "I promise." "I know you will, dear. Now, I'll leave you to get started. Take your time, figure out what you need. Paper for making lists, perhaps, or boxes for sorting. Anything you need, just ask." After Hattie left, Clara stood alone in the small room, surrounded by the beloved books of a woman she'd never met but felt she was beginning to know. Sarah Forrester had loved learning, had valued education, had seen beauty in the world, and wanted to share it with the man she loved. In these books, Clara could trace the outline of a kindred spirit, someone who'd understood that knowledge was its own kind of freedom, that words could transport you beyond the limitations of your circumstances. She spent the morning lost in the work, creating a system for cataloging and organizing. She grouped books by subject first, then by author within those categories. She made careful notes of condition, marking volumes that needed repair. She found more inscriptions, more glimpses into Sarah and Eli's life together. A pressed flower marking a page of love poetry, a note in masculine handwriting, Eli's, she assumed, that read, "Read this passage to me again tonight." By midday, Clara had made significant progress and also gained a much clearer picture of the woman whose books she was organizing. Sarah had been curious, romantic, intellectually voracious, and deeply in love with her husband. The books themselves told a story of a marriage built on shared interests and genuine companionship. Hattie called her to lunch, and they ate simple sandwiches at the kitchen table while Hattie peppered Clara with questions about her teaching philosophy and her plans for the school. Clara found herself opening up in ways she rarely did, talking about her belief that education should be available to all children regardless of gender or economic status, about her dreams of creating a library that students could access, about her conviction that learning to think critically was more important than simple memorization. "You're going to shake up Juniper Springs," Hattie said with obvious approval. "That town needs shaking up. Too many people content with the way things have always been, not enough willing to imagine how things could be better." In the afternoon, Clara returned to the study and continued her work. She was so absorbed in cataloging a collection of Shakespeare's works that she didn't hear Eli return until his voice from the doorway startled her. "You've made incredible progress," he said, and she looked up to find him leaning against the doorframe, hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in." Clara stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I hope I haven't overstepped. I found some paper in the desk and started making lists of what's here and what condition everything is in. Some of the older volumes need rebinding, and there are a few that have water damage that should probably be treated before it gets worse." Eli stepped into the room, his eyes moving over the now organized shelves, the neat stacks she'd created, the careful notes spread across the desk. "You've done more in one day than I've managed in 4 years. This is—" Sarah would be pleased to see her books so well cared for. The emotion in his voice made Clara's heart ache. She had wonderful taste. The breadth of subjects here is remarkable. She must have been an extraordinary woman. "She was," Eli said simply. He moved to one of the shelves, running his hand along the spines in a gesture that spoke of old familiarity and lingering grief. "I keep meaning to sort through these, but every time I try, I find myself just reading random pages and remembering. Not the most efficient system." "Memory is its own kind of organization," Clara said gently, "and grief doesn't follow efficient timelines." Eli looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. "You understand that. Not everyone does." "I lost both my parents before I turned 20, Clara said. "My father first, then my mother 2 years later. I understand how grief can ambush you at unexpected moments, how something as simple as opening a book can suddenly transport you back to a time when everything was different." They stood in silence for a moment, and Clara had the strange sensation that something significant was happening, though she couldn't have explained what. It felt like recognition, two people who'd both learned to carry loss acknowledging that burden in each other. "I spoke with the blacksmith," Eli said finally, breaking the moment. "He'll have your wagon in the shop by tomorrow morning and should have a new wheel built within 3 days. I also stopped by the school board office. Harvey Hutchins was very apologetic about the confusion regarding the teacher's quarters. Turns out they're at least 6 weeks from completion, possibly more. He was relieved when I told him you'd be staying here in the meantime. 6 weeks, Clara repeated. That's longer than you initially thought. It is. If that changes your mind about staying here. No, Clara said quickly. If the offer still stands, I'd like to stay. This work with the books, it's meaningful. And Hattie has been so kind, and you've been so generous. She stopped, realizing she was rambling. What I mean is, thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Something in Eli's expression softened. The gratitude goes both ways, Miss Dawson. Having someone in this room again, giving these books the attention they deserve, it means more than I can adequately express. Clara, she said impulsively, if we're to be living under the same roof for 6 weeks, perhaps we should dispense with the formality. Please call me Clara. Clara, Eli repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his low voice. Then you should call me Eli. Mr. Forrester makes me feel like I should be 50 years old and complaining about my rheumatism. Clara laughed, actually laughed, and the sound surprised her. When was the last time she'd felt light enough for genuine laughter? Over the following days, a comfortable routine established itself at Forester Creek Ranch. Clara would rise early and help Hattie with breakfast, then spend the morning hours in the study organizing Sarah's library. After lunch, she'd often sit on the porch and read, or help Hattie with various household tasks, or take walks along the creek that gave the ranch its name. Evenings were spent in the main room, where Hattie would sew or knit, Clara would read, and Eli, when he came in from the day's work, would sit in his chair by the fire and sometimes read as well. It was on the third evening that Eli, dusty and tired from mending fence all day, surprised Clara by asking, "What are you reading?" She looked up from her book. Emerson, Self-Reliance. I've read it before, but it's one of those works that reveals new layers each time. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string, Eli quoted quietly. Clara's eyebrows rose. You know Emerson? Sarah used to read his essays aloud to me, said I needed to understand transcendentalism if I was going to be married to her. His mouth quirked in that almost smile. I'll confess I didn't understand half of what Emerson was getting at, but Sarah had a way of making even the most complex philosophy seem relevant to daily life. What did you make of his ideas? Clara asked, genuinely curious. Eli thought about it, absently turning his coffee cup between his hands. I think he was right about self-reliance in principle, but I also think he maybe didn't fully appreciate how much we need each other. Out here, on the frontier, you can't survive by relying only on yourself. You need community, need people you can trust to help when times are hard. Maybe that's not what he meant, but that's what I took from it. Clara found herself impressed by his thoughtfulness. Many men would have dismissed Emerson entirely as impractical Eastern thinking, but Eli had engaged with the ideas seriously and formed his own nuanced opinion. I think you might be reading him more clearly than many scholars do, she said. There's a difference between self-reliance and isolation. One is strength, the other is just loneliness dressed up as philosophy. Is that what you think you've been doing? Eli asked quietly. Dressing up loneliness as philosophy? The question hit closer to home than Clara was comfortable with. She'd spent years telling herself that her solitary life was a choice, that her independence was empowering, that she didn't need what other women seemed to want. But sitting in this warm room, with Hattie humming over her mending and Eli watching her with those storm-gray eyes, Clara had to confront the possibility that she'd been lying to herself. Perhaps, she admitted, I told myself I'd chosen to be alone, that it was better than compromising who I was to fit someone else's expectations. But maybe the truth is I was just protecting myself from disappointment. Can't say I blame you for that, Eli said. Disappointment hurts. Loss hurts worse. Is that why you've stayed alone since Sarah? The question was out before Clara could stop it. Too personal, too intrusive. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. No, it's all right, Eli interrupted. You're right to wonder. The answer is yes and no. At first I stayed alone because I couldn't imagine being with anyone else. Sarah was everything to me, and when she died, it felt like the part of me that could love someone had died with her. But as time passed, I realized I wasn't staying alone out of loyalty to her memory. I was staying alone because I was scared. Scared of going through that kind of loss again. Scared of caring about someone and then having them taken away. That's a reasonable fear, Clara said softly. Reasonable, maybe, but also limiting. Eli set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Sarah used to tell me that the whole point of living was to be brave enough to connect with people, even knowing that loss is inevitable. She said that love, real love, was worth the risk of pain. I believed her then, trying to remember how to believe it now. The air in the room felt charged with something Clara couldn't name. Hattie had gone very still over her sewing, and Clara was acutely aware that whatever was happening in this conversation, it mattered. I spent my whole life being told I was too much, Clara heard herself say. Too smart, too opinionated, too ambitious. Men found me interesting for about 5 minutes. Then they'd realize I wasn't going to pretend to be less than I was to make them comfortable. After enough rejection, I convinced myself I didn't want what they were offering anyway. But sitting here, talking to you about Emerson and loss and fear, this is what I actually wanted all along, someone who could meet me where I am. Clara, Eli said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made her breath catch. But before he could continue, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard interrupted the moment. Eli stood quickly, hand going instinctively to the gun belt he'd removed after coming inside. Stay here, he said, moving to the door. Through the window, Clara could see 3 riders approaching the house in the dusk. They didn't look threatening exactly, but they moved with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they were used to being in charge. Eli stepped out onto the porch, and Clara heard him call out, "Evening, Marshal. What brings you out this way?" "Evening, Eli," came the response. "Sorry to bother you at this hour, but we've got a situation. Those outlaws that hit the bank in Silverton last week. We got word they're headed this direction, probably planning to cross into New Mexico territory. Governor wants a posse formed to track them down before they make it to the border." Clara's stomach clenched. She moved to the door, despite Eli's instructions to stay inside, and saw him talking with 3 men on horseback. The one in the middle wore a marshal's badge, and his face was grim. "How many men you need?" Eli asked. "As many as we can get. These aren't petty thieves. They killed 2 people in that robbery. We need good riders who can handle themselves in a fight. I know you've got ranch work to do, but..." "I'll go," Eli said without hesitation. "When do we leave?" "Dawn tomorrow. Plan is to track them through the high country. Try to cut them off before they reach the border. Could be gone 3-4 days, maybe longer." Clara felt cold fear wash through her. 4 days tracking dangerous outlaws through rough country, so many things could go wrong. But Eli was nodding, already discussing details of supplies and meeting points, and she realized this was who he was. A man who stepped up when needed, who didn't shy away from danger when the cause was right. After the marshal and his companions rode off, Eli came back inside to find Clara and Hattie both standing, worry evident on their faces. "I have to go," he said, looking at Clara. "Those outlaws are dangerous and they killed innocent people. If there's a chance we can stop them before they hurt anyone else..." "I understand," Clara said, though her voice was shaky. "Of course you have to go. Just be careful, please." Something flickered in Eli's eyes at her words. "I will. Hattie, can you..." "I'll take care of everything here, and I'll take care of Miss Clara," Hattie said firmly. "You just focus on coming back alive, Eli Forrester. I'm too old to break in a new boss." That night, Clara lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, thinking about Eli riding off into danger at dawn. She barely knew him. Less than a week had passed since he'd appeared through the dust to help her with her broken wagon. Yet somehow, in that short time, he'd become important to her in a way that defied logic. She thought about their conversation about Emerson, about fear and loss, and the courage it took to connect with another person. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she'd asked him to be careful, as if her concern meant something to him. Somewhere in the house, she heard movement. Eli, probably, preparing for tomorrow's departure. Clara made a decision. She wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and quietly made her way to the kitchen, where she found Eli packing supplies by lamplight. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Did I wake you?" he asked. "I tried to be quiet." "No, I couldn't sleep," Clara admitted. She hesitated, then said, "Eli, I need to tell you something before you leave tomorrow." He straightened, giving her his full attention, and Clara felt her courage waver. But she'd spent too many years being silent, hiding what she felt, protecting herself from disappointment. If Hattie was right, if Eli was the kind of man who could appreciate all of who she was, then he deserved to know the truth. These past few days here, she began, working with Sarah's books, talking with you and Hattie, being part of this place, it's been the happiest I've felt in longer than I can remember. And I realized tonight, thinking about you riding off to chase dangerous criminals, that I'd like many more of our conversations, many more evenings discussing philosophy and books and ideas. I'd like the chance to see where this, whatever this is between us, might lead. Eli was very still, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. Clara, he said quietly, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that I care about you more than is probably wise given we've known each other less than a week. I'm saying that the thought of something happening to you tomorrow terrifies me. And I'm saying that when you come back, because you will come back, I'd like to see if maybe we could have something more than employer and employee, more than host and guest. Eli closed the distance between them in 3 steps. He raised one hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek, and Clara's breath caught at the tenderness in the gesture. I'd like that too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. God help me, I know it's too soon, know I should be more cautious, but Clara, I feel like I've been half asleep for 4 years, and you walked into my life and woke me up. I want every conversation we can have. I want to know everything about you, what you think, what you dream, what makes you laugh. Then come back safely, Clara whispered. Please. Eli leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Clara didn't want to pull away. She tilted her face up to meet him, and when his lips touched hers, gentle and questioning, she felt something in her chest crack open, all the walls she'd built, all the protection she'd wrapped around her heart, suddenly insufficient against the tenderness of this moment. The kiss was brief, careful, full of promise rather than passion. When Eli pulled back, his gray eyes were bright with emotion. I'll come back, he said. I promise you, Clara, I'll come back. And as dawn broke over Forester Creek Ranch, and Clara watched Eli ride off with the marshal's posse, she held on to that promise with everything she had, and prayed that fate would be kind enough to keep it. The dust from the departing riders had barely settled when Hattie appeared on the porch beside Clara, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. She pressed one into Clara's cold fingers without a word, and together they stood watching the horizon where Eli and the posse had disappeared into the golden morning light. He'll be fine, Hattie said finally, her voice carrying a conviction Clara wished she felt. That man has survived things that would break most people. A few outlaws won't be what takes him down. Clara wrapped both hands around the mug, seeking its warmth. How do you stand it, watching him ride off like that, knowing the danger? Same way Sarah used to stand it when he'd go on cattle drives or help neighbors with difficult situations. You love someone. You let them be who they are, even when it scares you half to death. Hattie gave Clara a shrewd look. And before you try to tell me it's too soon for love, let me save you the breath. The heart doesn't follow calendars or proper timelines. Sometimes you just know. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, remembering the kiss in the kitchen just hours ago, the promises exchanged in lamplight. Is it that obvious? Only to someone with working eyes, dear. The way he looks at you when he thinks you're not watching, the way you light up when he walks in a room, I'd have to be blind not to see it. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Wait for him to come home, Clara said simply, and then see where this leads us. The waiting proved harder than Clara anticipated. The first day passed slowly, filled with work in the study and restless energy she tried to channel into organizing books. By evening, she found herself standing at the window facing east, as if she might somehow catch a glimpse of riders returning across the prairie. Hattie had to call her 3 times before she heard the summons to dinner. The second day brought a thunderstorm that rolled across the plains with dramatic fury, lightning splitting the sky and rain hammering the roof with a sound like 1,000 tiny fists. Clara stood on the covered porch, watching the deluge and trying not to think about Eli somewhere out there, wet and cold and possibly in danger. When Hattie found her, she didn't scold, just wrapped a blanket around Clara's shoulders and stood beside her. Storm like this, they'll have found shelter, Hattie said. Eli knows every cave and overhang in these mountains. He'll keep himself and the others safe." "You can't know that," Clara whispered. "No," Hattie agreed, "but I can choose to believe it, and choosing hope is better than drowning in fear." That evening, unable to concentrate on reading, Clara asked Hattie to tell her more about Eli and Sarah. The older woman settled into her chair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking in a soothing rhythm as she spoke. "They met at a church social, like I told you before. Sarah's family had just arrived from Philadelphia. Her father was setting up a medical practice in the territory. She was 19, fresh from finishing school, probably the most educated young woman anyone in these parts had ever met. And there was Eli, 22, working as a ranch hand, rough around the edges but honest right through." Hattie smiled at the memory. Story goes that some of the other young men were trying to impress Sarah with fancy talk and exaggerated stories. Eli just stood there quiet, not saying much. Finally, Sarah asked him directly what he did, and he said, "I work cattle, ma'am. It's hard work and it's honest work, and I'm good at it. But I won't pretend to be something I'm not just to win your favor." Sarah told me later that's the moment she fell for him. His complete honesty, the way he respected her enough not to put on airs. "What did her parents think?" Claire asked. "Oh, they weren't pleased initially. Their educated daughter with a ranch hand? They'd had hopes she'd marry a professional man, someone from their own social class. But Sarah was stubborn. Runs in her family, I think. And she told them flat out that Eli Forrester was worth 10 of the fancy men they kept parading in front of her. Eventually they came around, especially after they saw how devoted he was to her." Hattie's needles paused. The beautiful thing about their marriage was that Eli never felt threatened by Sarah's education. He admired it, wanted to learn from her, and Sarah never made him feel less than for being a working man. She saw his intelligence, his integrity, his capacity for growth. They built a real partnership, not one where someone has to diminish themselves to make the other comfortable. Clara thought about her own past. The men who'd been initially intrigued by her education but quickly uncomfortable when they realized she wasn't going to hide her intelligence. "That's rare," she said quietly. "It is," Hattie agreed, "but it exists, and I think you might have found it again if you're brave enough to reach for it." The third day brought no word, and Clara's anxiety ratcheted higher. She threw herself into work with almost manic energy, finishing the catalog of Sarah's entire collection and even beginning to draft lesson plans for her future students in Juniper Springs. Anything to keep her mind occupied, to keep the worst possibilities at bay. That evening, as Clara sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, Hattie appeared with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. "My late husband, God rest his soul, he used to say that sometimes a woman needs fortification for her nerves," Hattie announced, pouring generous measures into both glasses. "This is one of those times." Clara accepted the glass with a wan smile. "I'm not usually much of a drinker." "Neither am I. But tonight we make an exception. To Eli's safe return, and to women who are strong enough to love men who ride into danger." They clinked glasses and drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it did provide a certain warmth that helped ease the knot of tension in Clara's chest. As the evening wore on and the level in the bottle slowly dropped, Clara found herself talking more freely than she ever had with another woman. She told Hattie about her childhood, about a father who'd encouraged her education despite community disapproval, about a mother who'd supported her ambitions even while worrying she'd never find a husband. She talked about the loneliness of being different, of watching other women her age marry and have children while she remained apart, convinced she'd chosen books over love, because love was never really offered. "But it wasn't a choice," Clara said, the whiskey loosening her tongue. "Or at least not the choice everyone thought. I wasn't choosing books instead of love. I was choosing dignity instead of diminishment. I couldn't make myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of what a woman should be." "Good for you," Hattie said firmly. "World needs more women who refuse to shrink." "But Hattie," Clara continued, tears suddenly threatening, "what if I've wasted all these years protecting myself from something that might have been wonderful? What if I finally found someone who sees me, really sees me, and he doesn't come back? What if I waited too long, was too cautious, and now I've lost my chance?" "Clara Dawson, you listen to me." Hattie reached across the table and gripped Clara's hand. "You didn't waste anything. Every experience, every disappointment, every moment of loneliness brought you to exactly where you needed to be. You needed to be strong enough, independent enough, sure enough of yourself to recognize a good man when you found him. If you'd met Eli 5 years ago, before Sarah died, he wouldn't have been available. If you'd met him 2 years ago, he wouldn't have been ready. And if you'd met him before you'd built your own strength, you might not have had the courage to stay when your wagon broke down. You think it was meant to be? Clara asked. That my wheel breaking was fate? I think life breaks things sometimes to show us what's really important. I think you and Eli found each other at exactly the right moment, when you were both finally ready to be found. And I think that man is going to come back because he has something worth coming back to. The words settled over Clara like a blessing, and she felt some of her fear ease. Not disappear, she was still worried, still anxious, but at least now it was tempered with hope. The fourth morning dawned clear and cold, and Clara woke with a pounding headache from the whiskey and a sense of restless anticipation she couldn't shake. She helped Hattie with breakfast, then returned to the study, trying to distract herself with work. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching the road. It was mid-afternoon when she heard it. The sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. Her heart leaped into her throat as she dropped the book she'd been holding and ran to the porch, Hattie close behind her. 6 riders came into view, moving at a quick but controlled pace. Clara's eyes frantically scanned them, trying to count, trying to see if Eli was among them. She couldn't tell from this distance, couldn't make out individual faces, and the fear that he might not be there threatened to overwhelm her. There, Hattie said, pointing. Second from the left. That's Eli's bay. Clara squinted against the afternoon sun, and yes, that was definitely Eli's horse. But was Eli on it? The rider's posture looked wrong somehow, slumped forward in a way that made Clara's blood run cold. Hattie, something's wrong. I see it. Come on, help me get water heated and bandages ready. If he's hurt, we'll need supplies. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity as they prepared for the worst. By the time the riders reached the ranch, Clara had forced herself into a semblance of calm, though her hands shook as she stood on the porch waiting. The marshal was the first to dismount, his face grim with exhaustion and something else. Respect, Clara thought, or perhaps admiration. He touched his hat to Clara and Hattie. Ladies, we got them, all 4 outlaws in custody, and we recovered most of the stolen money. But it was a hard fight. Your man Forrester here, he's the reason we succeeded. Tracked them through terrain I wouldn't have thought passable, kept us on their trail when we'd have given up. And when it came to the confrontation, well, he saved at least 2 lives, maybe more. Is he hurt? Clara demanded, stepping forward. From this angle she could see Eli still on his horse, clearly conscious but moving carefully, one hand pressed to his side. Got grazed by a bullet and took a pretty hard fall when his horse stumbled during the chase. Nothing life-threatening, but he's going to be sore for a few days. The marshal gestured to 2 of the other riders. Help him down, boys. Carefully now. Clara watched as they eased Eli from his horse, his face pale beneath several days' worth of dirt and stubble. When his feet hit the ground, his knees buckled slightly and the men steadied him. His eyes found Clara immediately, and despite the pain evident in his expression, he smiled. Told you I'd come back, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Clara wanted to run to him, wanted to throw her arms around him and never let go. But Hattie was already moving with practiced efficiency, directing the men to help Eli into the house. Clara followed, her medical instincts warring with her emotional need to just hold him. They got Eli settled in a chair in the kitchen, and Hattie immediately began examining his injuries with the no-nonsense competence of someone who'd dealt with ranch accidents before. The bullet had indeed only grazed his side, leaving a deep furrow that had bled considerably but wasn't serious. The fall had left him bruised and battered, with what Hattie suspected might be a cracked rib or 2, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and rest. You're lucky, Hattie pronounced, wrapping bandages around his torso with firm efficiency. Few inches to the left and that bullet would have done real damage. As it is, you'll be laid up for a few days, but you'll live. Good thing, Eli said, and his eyes found Clara again. I made promises I intend to keep. The marshal and his men didn't stay long, just long enough to accept Hattie's offer of coffee and food for the road. Before they left, the marshal pulled Clara aside. I don't know what's between you and Eli Forrester, ma'am, but I want you to know he's one of the finest men I've known. When the shooting started, he didn't hesitate, threw himself in front of young Tommy Henderson when one of those outlaws drew down on him. That bullet that grazed him, that was meant for Tommy. Your man took it instead. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. He's not, we're not. Maybe not yet, the marshal said kindly. But I saw the way he looked at you when we rode up, and I saw the way you're looking at him now. That's a man who has something to live for again, and I'm thinking you're that something. Don't let him slip away, Miss Dawson. Good men like that don't come along often. After the marshal and his men departed, Hattie shooed Clara into the kitchen with Eli while she went to prepare a proper meal for everyone. Clara pulled up a chair beside Eli, close enough that their knees almost touched. You saved someone's life, she said quietly. Did what anyone would have done, Eli replied, but she could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. No, not anyone. Most people freeze in moments like that, or they run, or they save themselves first. You threw yourself in front of a bullet meant for someone else. Clara reached out and took his hand, dirty and calloused and absolutely perfect. The marshal called you a hero. I'm not a hero, Clara. I'm just a man who's already lost too much. The thought of that boy Tommy dying, his parents going through what I went through, I couldn't let it happen. Not if I could stop it. You could have died, Clara whispered, and now the tears did fall, tracking down her cheeks unchecked. You promised me you'd come back, and you could have died. Eli raised his free hand to her face, wiping away tears with his thumb. But I didn't. I came back, just like I promised. I came back to you. The kiss was different this time, not careful and questioning like the one in the pre-dawn kitchen, but urgent and real, full of relief and need, and the bone-deep gratitude of two people who'd been given a second chance. Clara tasted salt from her own tears, and the dust from 4 days on the trail, and she didn't care. All that mattered was that he was here, alive, solid and real beneath her hands. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eli rested his forehead against hers. I thought about you the whole time I was gone. When we were tracking those outlaws through the mountains, when the bullets started flying, when I was lying on the ground after my horse fell, all I could think was that I had to make it back because there was this brilliant, beautiful woman waiting for me, and I'd just started to know her. I thought about you too, Clara admitted. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept imagining the worst, kept thinking that I'd finally found someone who saw me as I am, and I might lose him before we even had a chance. You won't lose me, Eli said fiercely. Not if I have any say in it. Clara, I know this is fast. Too fast by conventional standards, Clara interrupted. But conventional standards told me I'd be alone forever because I was too educated, too opinionated, too much. I'm done with conventional standards. Good, Eli said, and kissed her again. Softer this time, but no less meaningful. Because I'm done with them too. Over the next few days, as Eli recovered from his injuries, Clara found herself falling into a new kind of routine. She continued her work with the books, but now she'd often read passages aloud to Eli as he rested on the sofa, his eyes closed but a small smile playing at his lips. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, about childhoods and dreams and fears and hopes. Clara learned that Eli had grown up in Massachusetts, the son of a shopkeeper who'd died young, leaving his family in poverty. He'd come west at 17 with nothing but determination and a willingness to work hard. He told her about learning to be a cowboy, about the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. He spoke of Sarah with love, but without the raw grief that had been there before, as if Clara's presence had somehow given him permission to remember the good without being destroyed by the loss. In turn, Clara told Eli things she'd never shared with anyone, about the isolation of being the smartest girl in school, about male professors at college who'd been alternately patronizing and inappropriate, about job offers that had evaporated when school boards learned she had actual opinions about pedagogy. She told him about the men who'd courted her briefly before deciding she was too much work, and the women who'd whispered that she'd end up a lonely spinster if she didn't learn to hold her tongue. Their loss, Eli said simply when she finished, and my incredible good fortune. One evening, about a week after Eli's return, Claire received a letter from her cousin Martha in Juniper Springs. She read it aloud to Eli and Hattie over dinner, her voice full of excitement. Martha says the school is ready for me to come meet with the board and see the building. The teacher's quarters still aren't finished, but she's offered me a room at her boarding house until they are at family rates, she says, so it won't break my budget. She wants me to come to town this week if possible. That's wonderful news, Hattie said warmly. Those children are lucky to get you as their teacher. I'll take you, Eli said immediately. The doctor cleared me for light riding yesterday, and the trip to Juniper Springs is easy enough. We can make it in a day if we start early. Clara looked at him across the table, this man who'd become so important to her in such a short time, and felt a complicated mix of excitement and apprehension. Going to Juniper Springs meant starting her new life, taking up the position she'd worked so hard to earn, but it also meant leaving the ranch, leaving this bubble of happiness she'd found with Eli and Hattie. Once she moved to town, everything would change. As if reading her thoughts, Eli said quietly, Clara, just because you're going to Juniper Springs doesn't mean this ends. The ranch is only a few miles from town. I can visit. You can come here on weekends if you want. We'll figure it out. Promise? She asked, hating how uncertain she sounded. Promise, he said firmly. You're not getting rid of me that easily, school teacher. They set out for Juniper Springs 2 days later, riding side by side under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Eli was still moving a bit carefully, favoring his injured side, but he sat his horse with the same easy confidence Clara had first noticed. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the territory, painting a picture of a community that was rough around the edges but fundamentally decent. The school board is made up of Harvey Hutchins. You'll remember him from the confusion about your quarters, Tom Chen, who owns the general store, and Reverend Samuel Matthews. Harvey means well, but he's disorganized. Tom is sharp as a tack and fair-minded. The Reverend is traditional, but he genuinely cares about education. They might be taken aback at first by how modern your teaching methods are, but if you're patient with them, they'll come around. And if they don't, Clara asked, then you do what you think is right anyway, and eventually they'll see the results in their children and realize you were right all along. Eli glanced at her with a smile. You're going to be amazing, Clara. Those kids are going to love you. Juniper Springs turned out to be larger than Clara expected. A town of perhaps 500 souls clustered around a main street lined with wooden buildings. There was a hotel, a general store, a saloon, the boarding house Martha ran, a church, and at the far end of town, a whitewashed building with a bell tower, the school. Martha Pruitt was waiting on the porch of her boarding house when they arrived, and she swept Clara into a fierce hug the moment she dismounted. Thank God you're safe. When Tom Simmons' sister sent word that you were staying at Forrester Ranch, I was worried sick. A woman alone with a strange man. Hattie Simmons was there the entire time, Clara interrupted gently. And Mr. Forrester has been nothing but a gentleman. He saved my life, actually, when my wagon broke down miles from anywhere. Martha pulled back and gave Eli a thorough once-over, her eyes sharp and assessing. Eli met her gaze steadily, making no attempt to charm or deflect. Finally, Martha nodded. Hattie speaks well of you, and my cousin looks happy. Happier than I've seen her in years, actually. I suppose that's recommendation enough. You're welcome in my home, Mr. Forrester. I appreciate that, ma'am, Eli said. And I'll be heading back to my ranch shortly, so your cousin will be entirely in your capable hands. They had lunch at the boarding house, where Martha caught Clara up on all the town gossip. The teachers' quarters were indeed still under construction, at least another month away from completion, Martha estimated. In the meantime, Clara would have a comfortable room at the boarding house, with meals included and access to Martha's small but well-curated library. After lunch, they walked to the school so Clara could meet the board members and see her new classroom. The building was simple but well-maintained, with 2 large rooms for different age groups and a surprising number of books already on the shelves. Harvey Hutchins, a rotund man with a perpetually worried expression, apologized profusely for the confusion about the teachers' quarters. Entirely my fault, Miss Dawson. I should have verified the construction timeline before writing to you. I do hope this hasn't caused too much inconvenience. Not at all, Clara assured him. Things have worked out beautifully, actually. Tom Chen, the store owner, was a Chinese immigrant with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. He asked Clara detailed questions about her teaching philosophy and her plans for the curriculum, nodding thoughtfully at her answers. Reverend Matthews was more reserved, clearly a bit uncertain about this modern young woman who spoke so confidently about education reform. But he was polite and seemed genuinely interested in Clara's ideas about incorporating more literature and critical thinking into the lessons. As they toured the school, Clara felt excitement building in her chest. This was what she'd worked for, what she'd dreamed about, her own classroom, her own students, the opportunity to make a real difference in young lives. The room was filled with afternoon light, and she could already imagine it full of children, their faces bright with curiosity and eagerness to learn. "When can you start?" Tom Chen asked. "I could begin preparing immediately," Clara said. "I'd like at least a week to organize the classroom and finalize my lesson plans, and then I could start teaching. Would 2 weeks from Monday work?" The board members conferred briefly and agreed. Clara would officially begin her position as Juniper Springs school teacher in just over 2 weeks. As they finalized the details, her salary, the school schedule, expectations for community involvement, Clara found herself glancing at Eli, who'd been standing quietly near the door. His expression was proud, she thought, and maybe a little sad. She understood the sadness. This moment marked the beginning of her new life, but it also meant the end of their time together at the ranch. After the meeting concluded and the board members departed, Clara and Eli stood alone in the empty classroom. The afternoon light painted everything gold, and dust motes danced in the air between them. "This is it," Clara said softly. "The beginning of everything I've worked for. You're going to be magnificent," Eli said, moving closer. "These children have no idea how lucky they are." "Eli, about us," Clara started, but he shook his head. "We don't have to figure everything out right now. You focus on getting settled, on starting your teaching. I'll be here, Clara, not going anywhere. And when you're ready, when you found your footing, we'll talk about what comes next." "What if I'm ready now?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. "What if I don't want to wait to figure out what comes next?" Eli's eyes darkened with emotion. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then tell me what you want." "I want this," Clara said, gesturing to the classroom around them. "I want to teach, want to make a difference, want to use everything I've learned and everything I am to help these children grow. But I also want you. I want more conversations by the fire, more debates about philosophy and literature. I want to see where this connection between us leads. I don't want to choose between my independence and having someone in my life who values me for exactly who I am." "Then don't choose," Eli said simply. "Have both. Be the teacher you were meant to be, and let me be the man who's proud to stand beside you. We'll figure out the details as we go. But Clara, you never have to diminish yourself to be with me. Your brilliance, your ambition, your independence, those aren't obstacles to loving you. They're reasons I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. She'd cried more in the past 2 weeks than she had in years, but these were good tears, happy tears. "You're falling in love with me?" she whispered. "Have been since you stood beside that broken wagon with a pistol in your hand and wariness in your eyes, refusing to be a victim or a damsel in distress," Eli admitted. "Probably should have fought it harder, probably should have been more sensible about the whole thing. But I spent 4 years being sensible and careful and protecting myself from feeling anything. I'm done with that. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste time pretending I don't feel what I feel." Clara laughed through her tears. "They said I'd be alone forever. Every matchmaker in 3 counties gave up on me. I was too educated, too outspoken, too independent to ever find a husband." "Their loss and my gain," Eli said, echoing his words from weeks earlier. He pulled her closer, careful of his still healing injuries. "And Clara? For what it's worth, I think we're going to prove them all wrong. Every single person who said you'd be alone, who said I'd never move on from grief, they're going to watch us build something beautiful together." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Forrester?" Clara asked, her tone teasing but her heart serious. "Not yet," Eli said, with that almost smile she'd come to love. "When I propose, and I will propose, make no mistake about that, it's going to be perfect, romantic and meaningful and worthy of the woman you are. But this is a promise. Forever starts with me, Clara Dawson, if you'll have me." "Forever starts with us," Clara corrected, and kissed him there in the golden afternoon light of her empty classroom, sealing a promise that neither of them fully understood yet, but both were brave enough to reach for. Outside, Juniper Springs went about its business, unaware that in the new schoolhouse, Something quietly momentous had just occurred. Two people who'd both been resigned to loneliness had found each other through a combination of chance and choice, and they were choosing to believe that love was possible even when the world had told them otherwise. As they finally pulled apart and prepared to return to Martha's boarding house, Clara looked around her classroom one more time. In 2 weeks, it would be filled with students and lessons and all the beautiful chaos of learning. But right now, in this moment, it held something equally precious, the promise of a future she'd stopped believing in, offered by a quiet cowboy who'd learned to see past his grief and a school teacher who'd learned to trust again. They said she'd be alone forever. But Eli Forrester had said forever starts with me, and Clara was beginning to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the right person could change everything. The 2 weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Clara breathless and exhilarated. She threw herself into preparing her classroom with an energy born of genuine passion, arriving at the schoolhouse each morning before the sun had fully risen and often staying until the light faded from the sky. She arranged desks to encourage discussion rather than rote memorization, organized the existing books into a lending library system, and created lesson plans that balanced traditional subjects with critical thinking exercises that would have made her college professors proud. Martha proved to be an invaluable ally, introducing Clara to the families whose children would be her students, and quietly vouching for the new teacher's character whenever the town gossips started whispering about the unmarried woman who'd spent nearly 2 weeks living at a bachelor's ranch. The whispers never grew into anything more serious, partly because of Martha's influence and partly because Hattie Simmons had come to town specifically to set the record straight at the general store, where she loudly proclaimed that Clara Dawson was a respectable woman who'd been given proper chaperoning the entire time, and anyone who suggested otherwise could take it up with her personally. But despite the busy days and the excitement of starting her new position, Clara found herself thinking constantly about Eli. True to his word, he'd ridden into town twice during those 2 weeks, each visit carefully timed to avoid impropriety, but long enough for them to steal moments together. They'd walk along the creek that ran behind the school, talking about everything and nothing, and each time he left, Clara felt the parting more keenly. On the evening before her first day of teaching, Clara sat in her room at Martha's boarding house, reviewing her lesson plans one final time. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration, and she looked up to find her cousin standing in the doorway with an expression that was equal parts amused and knowing. "You have a visitor," Martha announced. "Mr. Forrester is downstairs in the parlor, asking if you might join him for a walk. At this hour, mind you, with the sun already setting. Scandalous." Clara's heart leaped. She hadn't expected to see Eli until after her first week of teaching. "Is it really scandalous if we stay in sight of the main street?" "Probably not, but don't let that stop the gossips from trying," Martha said with a laugh. "Go on, go see your cowboy. Just be back before full dark, or I'll have to come find you with a lantern and pretend to be the disapproving chaperone." Clara hurried downstairs to find Eli waiting in the parlor, hat in his hands, looking slightly uncomfortable surrounded by Martha's delicate furniture and lace doilies. When he saw Clara, his face transformed with a smile that made her breath catch. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I know you start teaching tomorrow, but I wanted to see you before your first day. Brought you something." He held out a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine. Clara took it, feeling the weight of a book, and carefully unwrapped it to reveal a beautiful leather-bound journal, the pages thick and cream-colored, perfect for writing. "I thought you might want to record your experiences," Eli explained, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "Your first year of teaching, the students you meet, the challenges and victories. Sarah used to keep journals, and she always said that writing things down helped her understand them better. I asked the stationer in Silverton to make this special, with your initials on the cover." Clara ran her fingers over the embossed CD on the leather, feeling emotion well up in her throat. It was such a thoughtful gift, so perfectly suited to who she was, and the fact that Eli had ridden all the way to Silverton to commission it just for her spoke volumes about his feelings. "Eli, this is beautiful. Thank you." She looked up at him, seeing the hope and nervousness in his gray eyes. "Would you like to take that walk?" They strolled along Main Street as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, talking quietly about Clara's preparations and her nervousness about the next day. Eli listened with his characteristic patience, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement when her anxiety threatened to overwhelm her confidence. "What if they don't like me?" Clara asked as they paused near the church, where the street ended and the open prairie began. "What if the parents complain that my methods are too unconventional, or the children find me too strict, or—" "Clara," Eli interrupted gently, turning to face her. "Do you know what I think? I think you're going to walk into that classroom tomorrow, and you're going to be exactly who those children need. Not because you're perfect or because everything will go smoothly, but because you genuinely care about teaching them to think, not just to memorize. That kind of teaching, that's rare, and it matters." "You have more faith in me than I have in myself right now," Clara admitted. "Then borrow mine until you find your own again," Eli said simply. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I believe in you, Clara Dawson, completely and without reservation." They stood there as the light faded, hands intertwined, and Clara felt some of her anxiety ease. Tomorrow would bring challenges, certainly, but she wouldn't be facing them alone. Even if Eli wasn't physically present in her classroom, knowing he believed in her made all the difference. "I should get you back before Martha sends out a search party," Eli said reluctantly. "But Clara, I'll be thinking about you tomorrow, wishing I could be there to see you in your element." "Maybe someday you can visit," Clara suggested. "Come see what all your faith has produced." "I'd like that," Eli said, and the warmth in his voice made Clara's heart skip. The first day of teaching arrived with a sunrise that seemed almost absurdly perfect, as if nature itself was conspiring to give Clara confidence. She dressed carefully in her most professional dress, pinned her hair into a neat bun, and walked to the schoolhouse with the journal Eli had given her tucked under her arm. The students began arriving shortly after 8 o'clock, ranging in age from 6 to 16. There were 23 in total, the children of ranchers and shopkeepers, the offspring of the town's blacksmith, and the hotel owner, a mix of backgrounds and abilities that would have intimidated a less determined teacher. Clara greeted each one at the door, learning names and noting the way some of the older boys slouched in their seats, with expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else, while some of the younger girls watched her with wide-eyed curiosity. "Good morning," Clara began once everyone was settled. "My name is Miss Dawson, and I'm honored to be your new teacher. I know some of you may have heard that I do things differently than Miss Abernathy did. That's true. So before we begin our lessons, I want to tell you what I believe about education." She moved from behind her desk to stand among them, making eye contact with each student. "I believe that all of you have brilliant minds capable of understanding complex ideas. I believe that asking questions is more important than memorizing answers. I believe that education should prepare you not just to make a living, but to live meaningful lives. And I believe that this classroom should be a place where we learn together, where your thoughts and ideas matter as much as what's written in textbooks." One of the older boys, perhaps 14, raised his hand skeptically. "So we don't have to memorize anything?" "I didn't say that," Clara replied with a smile. "There are some things worth committing to memory, multiplication tables, historical dates, poetry that moves your soul, but memorization without understanding is just recitation. I want you to understand why things matter, not just know that they do." She spent that first day assessing where each student was academically, engaging them in discussions that revealed not just what they knew, but how they thought. By the time she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, Clara was exhausted but elated. It hadn't been perfect. There had been moments of confusion, instances where her innovative methods had been met with blank stares, but there had also been sparks of genuine engagement, questions that showed real thinking, and a sense that these students were willing to trust her if she proved herself worthy of that trust. That evening, Clara sat in her room and made her first entry in the journal Eli had given her, describing the day in detail and noting which students seemed most engaged and which would need extra attention. As she wrote, she found herself including observations about her own feelings, her hopes and fears, and inevitably her thoughts turned to Eli. "I wish you could have seen it," she wrote. The moment when young Timothy Chen, Tom's nephew, made the connection between the mathematics problem and how his father uses calculations in the store. His whole face lit up with understanding, and I thought, this is why I teach. This is what matters. And I wanted to share that moment with you, wanted to see your smile when I told you about it. Is this what partnership feels like? Wanting to share not just the big moments, but the small victories too. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt both natural and exciting. Clara taught during the day, poured her energy into her students, and slowly began to see progress. The younger children soaked up knowledge like sponges, while the older students, initially resistant to her unconventional methods, gradually began to engage more deeply with the material. She introduced debates on historical events, encouraged creative writing projects, and started a reading circle where students could discuss books that interested them. The town's response was mixed. Some parents were thrilled with their children's newfound enthusiasm for learning. Others complained to the school board that Miss Dawson was filling their children's heads with unnecessary ideas, teaching them to question rather than accept. Harvey Hutchins nervously reported these complaints to Clara, but Tom Chen, who'd seen the change in his nephew, defended her methods vigorously. Reverend Matthews, surprisingly, became one of her strongest allies after she demonstrated how critical thinking could actually deepen faith rather than undermine it. Through it all, Eli remained a constant presence in Clara's life, though they had to be creative about finding time together. He came to town every Sunday after church, and they'd walk along the creek or sit on Martha's porch, talking for hours. Sometimes Hattie would come with him, bringing baked goods and news from the ranch, and those visits felt like family in a way that made Clara's heart ache with longing for something more permanent. It was on one of those Sunday visits, about 6 weeks after Clara had started teaching, that everything changed. Eli had brought Clara to a spot along the creek where wildflowers grew in profusion, painting the banks in shades of purple and gold. They sat on a fallen log, watching the water flow past, and Clara was telling him about a breakthrough one of her struggling students had made when she noticed he wasn't really listening. His expression was distant, troubled, and he kept glancing at her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "Eli, what is it?" she asked, interrupting her own story. "You've been quiet all afternoon, and you keep looking at me like you're trying to solve a complicated problem." He was silent for a long moment, then said, "Clara, do you ever think about the future? About what happens when the teacher's quarters are finished and you move out of Martha's boarding house? About where all of this is going?" Clara's heart began to pound. They'd carefully avoided this conversation, content to live in the present and let the future take care of itself. But she'd thought about it constantly, lying awake at night and imagining possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. "I think about it," she admitted. "Probably more than I should. Why? What are you thinking about?" Eli stood abruptly and began pacing along the creek bank, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of agitation Clara had never seen from him before. "I'm thinking that this arrangement we have, these Sunday visits and stolen moments, it's not enough. I'm thinking that I spend every day wishing you were at the ranch, and then feeling guilty for wishing that because I know how important your teaching is. I'm thinking that I'm in love with you, completely and utterly in love with you, and I don't know how to ask for what I want without sounding like I'm asking you to give up everything you've worked for." Clara stood too, her legs suddenly unsteady. "What do you want, Eli?" He turned to face her, and the naked emotion in his eyes took her breath away. "I want to marry you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to hear about your teaching victories over dinner and help you plan lessons and watch you change these children's lives. But I also know that marriage usually means a woman gives up her work, moves to her husband's ranch, becomes a wife instead of a teacher, and I won't ask you to do that. Your teaching matters too much. You matter too much." "So what are you saying?" Clara asked, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm saying I don't know how to make this work, but I want to try. I'm saying that maybe we need to write new rules, create a marriage that looks different than what everyone expects. You could keep teaching, keep living in town during the week, if that makes sense, and maybe—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I'm not explaining this well. Clara, what I'm trying to say is that I love you exactly as you are, doing exactly what you're meant to do, and I want to build a life that honors both of us, not one where either of us has to shrink or sacrifice who we are." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love for this man who was trying so hard to give her everything she needed. She closed the distance between them and took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "Eli Forrester, are you proposing to me while simultaneously trying to talk yourself out of it because you're worried about my career?" "I suppose I am," he admitted with a shaky laugh. Not the romantic proposal I'd planned, is it? It's perfect, Clara said fiercely. It's perfect because it's real and honest and because you're thinking about what I need, not just what you want. And here's what I need you to understand. I don't want to choose between teaching and being with you. I want both. And if that means we have to invent a new kind of marriage, then that's what we'll do. Is that a yes? Eli asked, hope dawning in his eyes. That's a yes, but only if you ask me properly, Clara said, smiling through her tears. I may be unconventional, but I still want the moment. Eli laughed, a sound of pure joy, and dropped to one knee right there on the creek bank. He took her hand in both of his, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. Clara Dawson, you are the most brilliant, passionate, stubborn, wonderful woman I have ever known. You walked into my life when I'd given up on the possibility of love, and you reminded me what it means to be fully alive. I love your mind and your heart and your fierce independence. I love the way you care about your students and the way you're not afraid to challenge ideas that don't make sense. I love that you kept a pistol in your pocket when we first met, and I love that you still keep it there sometimes. I want to spend the rest of my life supporting your dreams and building new ones with you. Will you marry me? Yes, Clara said, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. The kiss that followed was different from all the ones before. Not tentative or careful, not urgent with relief, but celebratory and certain. It was a kiss that said home and forever in partnership, and when they finally pulled apart, both were laughing and crying at once. I don't have a ring, Eli admitted. I wanted to wait until you said yes before I had one made. I wanted you to help choose it, actually. Sarah's ring. It's at home, and it's precious to me, but it was hers. I want you to have something that's yours that represents who you are. I love that idea, Clara said, and I love that you thought of it. Eli, I don't need to replace Sarah. I know you loved her, and that love is part of who you are. I'm not asking you to forget her or pretend that life didn't happen. I know, Eli said softly. That's one of the many reasons I love you. You understand that loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Sarah. It's just different. Both real, both important, but different. They stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, talking about practical matters now that the emotional decision had been made. They agreed that Clara would continue teaching for as long as she wanted. During the school year, she could stay in town during the week and come to the ranch on weekends, or they could see how things developed and adjust as needed. In the summers, when school was out, she'd live at the ranch full-time. They'd build their life together piece by piece with flexibility and communication rather than rigid expectations. People are going to talk, Clara warned. A wife who doesn't live with her husband full-time, that's going to scandalize half the territory. Let them talk, Eli said firmly. I spent 4 years caring too much about what people thought, about doing things the right way. All it got me was loneliness. I'm done with that. If people can't understand that we're building something real and good, that's their limitation, not ours. When they returned to town that evening, they went directly to Martha's boarding house to share the news. Martha took one look at their joined hands and Clara's radiant face and burst into tears of joy. Finally, I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. She pulled Clara into a fierce hug, then Eli. Oh, this is wonderful news. My cousin is marrying a good man, and that's worth celebrating. The news spread through Juniper Springs with the speed of wildfire. By the time Clara arrived at school the next morning, half the town seemed to know about her engagement. The responses were predictably mixed. Some people were genuinely happy for her. Others were scandalized that she planned to continue teaching after marriage. Mrs. Henderson, who'd once predicted Clara would die a lonely spinster, sniffed that it was highly irregular and probably wouldn't last. But Clara found she didn't care about the gossip as much as she once would have. She had Eli's love and support, Martha's unwavering loyalty, and most importantly, she had her own certainty that they were making the right choice. When Harvey Hutchins nervously approached her to ask if she planned to resign her teaching position, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "Absolutely not. Mr. Forrester and I have discussed this thoroughly, and we're in complete agreement that I'll continue as Juniper Springs teacher for as long as I'm effective in that role. Is that going to be a problem for the school board? Harvey stammered and hedged, but Tom Chen, who'd accompanied him, spoke up firmly. It's not a problem at all. Miss Dawson is the best teacher this town has ever had. The children are learning more than they ever did with Miss Abernathy. No disrespect to the departed, and my nephew actually wants to come to school now instead of finding excuses to stay home. If marriage was grounds for dismissal, we'd be fools. She stays. The wedding was planned for late November, after the fall harvest, but before winter weather made travel difficult. They decided to hold it at the ranch rather than in town, partly for practicality and partly because both Clara and Eli wanted the ceremony to take place somewhere meaningful to them. Hattie threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm, planning a menu and cleaning the house until it sparkled. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of continued teaching, wedding preparations, and stolen moments with Eli whenever they could arrange them. Clara's students, once they got over their initial surprise at their teacher's engagement, became invested in the romance. The younger girls peppered her with questions about love and marriage, while the older boys treated Eli with a newfound respect when he visited the school at Clara's invitation to talk to them about ranching and business mathematics. It was during one of those visits, about 2 weeks before the wedding, that disaster struck. The school day had just ended, and Clara was helping a struggling student with a reading assignment when one of the ranchers burst through the door, his face pale with panic. "Fire!" he shouted. "The Henderson Ranch is burning, house and barn both, and it's spreading fast with this wind. We need every able-bodied person who can help." Eli, who'd been in the corner discussing crop rotation with some of the older boys, was on his feet instantly. "How many people at the ranch?" "John Henderson got his wife and kids out, but the livestock are still in the barn and the fire's too hot to reach them. We need men and buckets and—" "I'm coming," Eli said, then turned to Clara. "Stay here. Keep the children safe." "Eli," Clara started, fear clutching at her heart, but he was already moving, kissing her quickly and firmly. "I'll be careful, I promise, but I have to help." And then he was gone, along with several of the townsmen and the older boys who were big enough to carry water buckets. Clara spent the next 3 hours in agony, watching the smoke rise in the distance and listening to reports from people running between the fire and the town. The flames had spread to the grass, threatening other nearby ranches. The wind was pushing it east toward Forester Creek. Multiple people had been injured trying to save livestock and property, but no one had any specific information about Eli. As dusk fell and Clara was preparing to close the school and go find Martha, a rider appeared, not Eli, but young Tommy Chen riding Eli's bay horse. Clara's heart stopped. "Miss Dawson," Tommy called, sliding off the horse. "Mr. Forrester sent me. He's all right, but he needs you to come. It's complicated, but he said to tell you he's all right and he needs you at the ranch." "What happened?" Clara demanded, already moving to saddle Rosie, who'd been in the school's small stable. "The fire spread to Forester Creek Ranch. They managed to stop it before it reached the house, but some of the outbuildings are damaged and, Miss Dawson, there were people there. A family traveling through had camped near the creek. They got caught by the fire and Mr. Forrester pulled them out. But they're hurt and they have a baby and—" Clara didn't wait to hear more. She mounted Rosie and rode toward the ranch at a speed that would have alarmed her on any other day, her medical training from her mother's nursing days already running through her mind. Burns, smoke inhalation, shock. She cataloged what supplies she might need, what she could do to help. The scene at the ranch was controlled chaos. Men were still putting out smoldering fires in the damaged outbuildings. Hattie was coordinating water and supplies. And in the ranch house, Clara found Eli kneeling beside a makeshift bed in the main room where a young woman lay with burns on her arms, a baby crying in a basket beside her, and a man, presumably the woman's husband, unconscious on another bed with a bloody bandage around his head. Eli looked up when Clara entered, and the relief in his eyes was palpable. "Thank God. Clara, this is James and Mary Sullivan and their daughter Emma. They were camped by the creek when the fire came through. James tried to save their wagon and got hit by a falling branch. Mary has burns from grabbing the baby from the flames. The baby seems okay, just frightened, but I don't know what to do for them." Clara immediately moved into action, examining the unconscious man first. The head wound was superficial, but he likely had a concussion. She checked his breathing and pulse, both steady, then moved to the woman whose burns were second degree but manageable if properly cared for. "Hattie, I need clean water, bandages, and do you have any honey?" Clara called out. "Honey?" Hattie appeared with supplies. "For burns?" "My mother was a nurse. She swore by honey for burn treatment. Helps prevent infection and promotes healing." Clara gently cleaned the woman's burns while explaining what she was doing, her voice calm and professional, even as her heart ached for this young family who'd been through such trauma. The baby, also named Emma, Clara realized with a pang, thinking of Eli's lost daughter, had stopped crying and was watching Clara with wide, solemn eyes. As Clara worked, Eli picked up the baby, holding her with a tenderness that brought tears to Clara's eyes. She could see the memory of his own lost child in his expression, the pain and the healing happening simultaneously. "They're going to be all right," Clara told Mary Sullivan after treating her burns. "Your husband has a concussion, so we'll need to watch him closely, but his breathing is good. You'll need to keep those burns clean and covered, but I don't think there will be permanent damage if we care for them properly. And your daughter is perfect, not even a scratch on her." "You saved us," Mary whispered, looking at Eli. "The fire was everywhere, and you ran through it to get to us. You could have died." "Couldn't leave you there," Eli said simply, still holding baby Emma. "Not when I could help." It was then that Clara understood what the marshal had meant weeks ago when he'd called Eli a hero. This was who he was, someone who ran toward danger when people needed help, who couldn't stand by when he had the power to make a difference. And Clara loved him even more for it, even as she wanted to shake him for risking himself again. The Sullivans stayed at the ranch for 3 days while James recovered from his concussion and Mary's burns began to heal. Clara visited each day after school, and she and Eli worked together to care for their unexpected guests. They learned that the Sullivans were headed west to Oregon, hoping to start fresh after losing their farm to debt back east. The fire had destroyed everything they owned except what they'd been wearing and the baby's basket. On the third night, after James was well enough to be moved, and Clara had arranged for the Sullivans to stay at Martha's boarding house until they could get new supplies, Eli walked Clara out to where Rosie was waiting. The smell of smoke still hung faintly in the air, and in the distance Clara could see the charred remains of the outbuildings. "That could have been so much worse," she said quietly. "You could have been killed, Eli. Again." "But I wasn't," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I'm right here. And in 2 weeks, I'm going to marry the most amazing woman in the territory." "Promise me something," Clara said against his chest. "Promise me that after we're married, you'll be a little more careful. Eli, I can't lose you. Not now that I've found you." "I promise to be as careful as I can while still being who I am," Eli said honestly. "I can't promise to never take risks, Clara, but I can promise that every risk I take, I'll be thinking about coming home to you. That'll make me more careful than anything else could." It wasn't quite the promise Clara wanted, but she recognized it was the only one he could truthfully make. And she loved him for his honesty, for refusing to lie just to comfort her. On November 20th, under a sky painted with the last brilliant colors of autumn, Clara Dawson married Eli Forrester in a ceremony that would be talked about in Juniper Springs for years to come. They'd invited everyone, townspeople, ranchers, the students, and their families, and to Clara's surprise, nearly all of them came. Even Mrs. Henderson appeared, though she sniffed disapprovingly through the entire ceremony. Clara wore a dress of deep blue that Martha had helped her make, simple but elegant. Eli wore his best suit, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothes. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and when Eli said his vows, promising to love Clara's mind as much as her heart, to support her dreams as well as share his own, to build a partnership based on mutual respect and honest communication, there wasn't a dry eye among the women present. Clara's vows were equally heartfelt. "They said I'd be alone forever," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They said I was too educated, too opinionated, too independent to ever be a wife. And you said forever starts with me. Eli, you've shown me that love doesn't require diminishment, that I can be fully myself and still be fully yours. I promise to honor that gift by being the best partner I can be, by supporting your dreams as you support mine, by facing challenges together, and by never taking for granted the miracle of finding someone who sees me completely and loves what he sees. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Eli kissed Clara with a tenderness that made the moment feel sacred despite the crowd of witnesses. And as they turned to face their community as Mr. and Mrs. Forrester, Clara saw acceptance on most faces, happiness on many, and a few grudging nods from those who'd predicted doom. The celebration that followed was joyous and chaotic. Hattie had outdone herself with the food, and someone had brought a fiddle, and before long the ranch yard was filled with music and dancing. The Sullivan family was there, James still looking a bit pale but recovering well, Mary's burns healing beautifully, and baby Emma passed around to be cooed over by every woman present. As the evening drew on and stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eli pulled Clara away from the crowd to a quiet spot behind the house where they could see the prairie stretching endlessly before them. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Ridiculously happy," Clara confirmed, "though I still can't quite believe this is real. A few months ago, I was resigned to spending my life alone, and now you're stuck with me," Eli finished with a smile. "Forever." "Forever," Clara repeated, and kissed him under the stars, sealing promises that had begun with a broken wheel and a stranger's kindness and had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. Behind them, the party continued, full of laughter and life and hope. Before them stretched the vast expanse of their future, unknown and exciting and full of possibility. They'd write their own story, create their own kind of marriage, and prove to everyone who doubted them that love could look different than expected and still be real. Forever had started with them, together, and that was enough. The first winter of their marriage tested the arrangement Clara and Eli had carefully constructed in ways neither had fully anticipated. Clara continued teaching in Juniper Springs, staying at Martha's boarding house during the week and coming home to the ranch each Friday evening. The pattern worked in theory, but the reality proved more complicated than either had imagined. The Tuesday after their wedding, Clara stood in front of her classroom and noticed several of the mothers lingering outside the schoolhouse windows, their expressions ranging from curious to disapproving. When she dismissed the students for lunch, Mrs. Henderson approached her with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Forrester," the older woman said, emphasizing the title with something that sounded like skepticism. "I was wondering if you might clarify something for those of us who are concerned about propriety. You're married now, yet you continue to sleep in town 4 nights a week while your husband remains at his ranch. Surely you can understand how this appears to some people?" Clara felt anger flash through her, hot and quick, but she forced her voice to remain calm and professional. "Mrs. Henderson, my living arrangements are between my husband and myself. I can assure you that we have come to a mutual agreement that serves both our needs and allows me to continue providing quality education to the children of this community. If you have concerns about my teaching, I'm happy to address them, but my marriage is not a subject for community debate." Mrs. Henderson's lips pursed. "I'm simply saying that it sets an unusual example for the young ladies in your care. What kind of wife chooses her career over her husband?" "The kind whose husband respects her enough to want her to fulfill her calling," Clara said, her patience fraying. "The kind whose marriage is built on partnership rather than possession. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mrs. Henderson, I have lessons to prepare." That evening, Clara sat in her room at Martha's boarding house and wrote a long letter to Eli, pouring out her frustration and uncertainty. Was she being selfish? Should she have anticipated the gossip would be this intense? Maybe they'd been naive to think they could defy convention without consequences. Eli's response arrived 2 days later, brought by one of his ranch hands who was delivering supplies to town. Clara recognized his handwriting on the envelope and tore it open eagerly. "My dearest Clara," it read, "I received your letter, and I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for wanting both teaching and marriage. You are brave. You are pioneering a new way of being a wife, and pioneers always face criticism from those who are comfortable with the old ways. Mrs. Henderson and her ilk can say what they like. We know the truth of our marriage, and that's what matters. Keep teaching. Keep changing those children's lives. And know that every day you're in Juniper Springs, I'm counting the hours until Friday when you come home to me. Your loving husband, Eli." Clara read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the journal he'd given her. She would keep teaching. She would keep fighting for the life they'd chosen. But she couldn't deny that the separation was harder than she'd expected, and the gossip wore on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The weeks passed, and slowly, grudgingly, the community began to adjust to the unusual arrangement. What helped most was that Clara's teaching continued to be exceptional. Students who'd been struggling began to thrive under her methods. The reading circle she'd established had become so popular that she'd had to split it into 2 groups to accommodate all the interested students. Even Reverend Matthews, initially uncertain about her unconventional approach, publicly praised her work after his granddaughter recited an entire Shakespeare soliloquy from memory and then explained its meaning with genuine understanding. But the vindication of her professional success couldn't completely ease the loneliness Clara felt during those weekday evenings without Eli. She'd catch herself listening for his footsteps, turning to share an observation only to remember he wasn't there. Martha was wonderful company, but it wasn't the same as falling asleep beside the man she loved. Eli felt the separation just as keenly. Hattie reported to Clara that he'd become quieter during the week, often standing at the window looking toward town as evening fell. He threw himself into ranch work with almost manic energy, expanding the cattle operation and beginning construction on additional outbuildings to replace what had been lost in the fire. But when Friday came and Clara arrived home, the transformation in him was visible to everyone. He became lighter, more animated, more himself. Their Friday evenings through Sunday afternoons became precious beyond measure. They'd stay up late talking by the fire, making up for the conversations they'd missed during the week. Clara would share stories about her students while Eli told her about ranch developments and community news. They'd read together, work on projects side by side, and simply exist in each other's presence with a contentment that felt like coming home. It was during one of those winter weekends, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, that their future took an unexpected turn. Clara had been feeling unwell for several weeks, tired beyond what her teaching schedule warranted, occasionally nauseous in the mornings. She'd attributed it to stress and the adjustment to married life, but when she mentioned it to Hattie, the older woman had given her a long, knowing look. "Clara, dear," Hattie said gently, "when was your last monthly course?" Clara stopped what she was doing, her mind racing back through the weeks. She'd been so busy with teaching and adjusting to marriage that she hadn't been paying attention to the calendar. When she realized it had been over 2 months, her hand went instinctively to her stomach. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Hattie, do you think—" "I think you might want to have Doc Pritchard confirm it, but yes, dear, I think you might be expecting." Hattie's face split into a wide smile. "And before you start worrying about what this means for your teaching, we'll figure it out. Women have been having babies and working since the dawn of time. We'll make it work." The news both thrilled and terrified Clara. She wanted children, wanted them desperately, actually, but the timing felt complicated. She'd only been teaching for a few months, was still establishing herself in the community. How would people react if their unmarried teacher became visibly pregnant? Would the school board demand her resignation? That evening, after Eli came in from checking on the livestock and they'd had dinner, Clara asked him to sit with her by the fire. Her hands were trembling as she took his, and he immediately looked concerned. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Clara assured him quickly. "Better than fine, actually. Eli, I think, that is, Hattie thinks, and I'm fairly certain she's right." She took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The expression that crossed Eli's face was complex and profound. Joy certainly, but also something deeper, a mixture of hope and fear, anticipation and memory. His eyes filled with tears, and he pulled Clara into his arms with a gentleness that made her own tears start to fall. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Clara, we're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, needing to hear it. "I know this is complicated, and it will change everything, and people are already talking about us enough without adding this to the mix." "I'm terrified," Eli admitted honestly, pulling back to look at her face. "After losing Emma, the thought of going through pregnancy and birth again, it scares me more than I can say. But Clara, I'm also happier than I've been since I lost them. This baby is a gift, a new beginning, and this time, God willing, I'll be here for all of it. I won't be away on some cattle drive. I'll be right beside you." They sat together for a long time, hands intertwined, talking about the future that had suddenly become more concrete and immediate. Clara confessed her fears about the school board's reaction, about losing the teaching position she'd fought so hard to establish. Eli listened without trying to minimize her concerns, then offered a suggestion that surprised her. "What if we built a schoolhouse on the ranch?" he said slowly, the idea clearly forming as he spoke. "Not to replace the town school, but as an addition. You could keep teaching in Juniper Springs for as long as you want, but we could also offer education to the ranch families out this way. Their children have to travel so far to get to town, and many of them don't go to school at all because of the distance. You could teach there too, maybe just a few days a week, whenever it worked for you." Clara stared at him, her mind racing with possibilities. "That's actually brilliant. It would give me options, especially after the baby comes. I could still teach without having to leave the baby for days at a time. And it would serve a real need," Eli continued, warming to the idea. "There are at least a dozen families within a 5-mile radius who don't send their children to school because of the distance. If we built something modest but functional right here, we could change that." The more they talked about it, the more excited Clara became. It was exactly the kind of innovative solution that reflected who they were as a couple, refusing to choose between options when they could create new possibilities instead. Doc Pritchard confirmed the pregnancy the following week. Clara was about 2.5 months along, which meant the baby would arrive in late spring or early summer, right after the school year ended. The timing was as perfect as it could be, though Clara knew there would still be challenges ahead. She decided to tell the school board herself rather than let gossip spread the news. On a cold January afternoon, she requested a meeting with Harvey Hutchins, Tom Chen, and Reverend Matthews. She sat before them in the empty classroom, her hands folded in her lap, and delivered the news directly. "Gentlemen, I wanted to inform you that I'm expecting a child. The baby is due in late May or early June, which means I'll be able to complete this school year. After that, I'll need to take some time away from teaching, though I hope to return to the classroom eventually, perhaps on a part-time basis." Harvey Hutchins looked uncomfortable. Tom Chen looked thoughtful, and Reverend Matthews looked genuinely pleased. It was the Reverend who spoke first. "Mrs. Forrester, this is wonderful news. Congratulations to you and your husband. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we're grateful you plan to finish out the year. As for the future, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." "There's also something else I'd like to discuss," Clara continued, encouraged by their response. "My husband and I are planning to build a small schoolhouse on our ranch property to serve the children of families in our area who can't easily access the town school. This wouldn't compete with Juniper Springs School, but would complement it, extending education to students who currently receive none. I wanted to inform you of our plans and assure you that this is about expanding educational opportunity, not diminishing what we're doing here." Tom Chen leaned forward, interest evident on his face. "How many families are you talking about?" "At least a dozen, possibly more. Children who are growing up without formal education because the distance to town is too great." "That's significant," Tom said, "and it's a problem I've heard discussed but never seen addressed. Mrs. Forrester, I think your plan has merit. In fact, I'd be willing to help however I can, donating supplies, providing books at cost, whatever would help make this succeed." Over the following weeks, word of both Clara's pregnancy and the planned ranch school spread through the community. Reactions were mixed, as Clara had expected. Some people were supportive, seeing the ranch school as a genuine public service. Others viewed it as Clara's way of avoiding her wifely duties by continuing to teach even after motherhood. And a few, like Mrs. Henderson, seemed determined to find fault no matter what Clara did. But Clara had learned not to let criticism paralyze her. She continued teaching with the same passion and dedication she'd always brought to the classroom, even as her pregnancy began to show. When some of the mothers expressed concern about their children seeing their teacher in such a delicate condition, Clara addressed it head-on in a letter to all the families. "Education should prepare children for real life," she wrote, "and real life includes the natural processes of birth and family. I make no apology for continuing to teach while expecting a child. I hope that my students, especially the young ladies, will see that a woman can be both a professional and a mother, that these roles need not be mutually exclusive. If this challenges conventional thinking, then perhaps conventional thinking needs to be challenged. Tom Chen had the letter printed in the small-town newspaper, and to Clara's surprise, it sparked a wave of support from unexpected quarters. Several women wrote responses praising Clara's stance, sharing their own stories of being forced to choose between work they loved and family life. Even some of the men spoke up, saying their daughters deserved to see that they could aspire to more than just housewifery if they chose. As winter gave way to spring, construction began on the ranch schoolhouse. It was a modest building, one large room with windows on 3 sides to let in plenty of light, a wood stove for heating, and built-in shelves for books. Eli did much of the work himself, with help from neighboring ranchers who saw the value in having education closer to home for their children. Clara watched the building take shape and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was theirs, a physical manifestation of their partnership and shared values. In April, with Clara now visibly pregnant and the school year winding down, she received an unexpected visitor at the ranch. Mary Sullivan, the young mother whose family Eli had saved from the fire, appeared at the door one Saturday morning with baby Emma, now a chubby, cheerful 8-month-old, on her hip. "Mrs. Forrester, I hope I'm not intruding," Mary said, looking nervous. "I've been wanting to speak with you for weeks now, and my husband finally convinced me to stop being a coward and just come." Clara invited her in, delighted to see how well both Mary and the baby had recovered from their ordeal. Over tea and Hattie's cookies, Mary's story came tumbling out. "After the fire, when we lost everything, I thought our dreams of going to Oregon were finished," Mary said. "We had no money, no supplies, no way to continue, but your husband and this community, they wouldn't let us give up. People donated clothes and food, Mr. Chen gave us supplies on credit, and your husband even gave my James work at the ranch so we could earn enough to keep going." "That's wonderful," Clara said warmly. "I'm so glad things worked out." "But that's not why I'm here," Mary continued. "Mrs. Forrester, Clara, what you and your husband did for us wasn't just about material help. You showed us what a real partnership looks like. The way you two work together, support each other's dreams, refuse to let the world tell you how your marriage should look. It gave me courage." Mary took a deep breath. "I've always loved to draw. Before James and I married, I dreamed of becoming an illustrator, maybe doing artwork for books or newspapers. But when we married, I put all that away because that's what wives were supposed to do. Watching you refuse to give up teaching even after marriage, seeing how your husband supports your work, it made me realize I don't have to give up my dreams either. I've started drawing again, and James is encouraging me. When we get to Oregon, I'm going to look for opportunities to sell my artwork." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. The pregnancy had made her more emotional than usual, and she reached across to squeeze Mary's hand. "That's beautiful, Mary. Never stop drawing. The world needs your art." "Thank you," Mary whispered, "and thank you for showing me it was possible. You're changing more than just your students' lives, Clara. You're showing all of us that there are different ways to be a woman, a wife, a person. That matters more than you know." After Mary left, Clara sat for a long time thinking about their conversation. She'd been so focused on her own struggles, fighting to keep teaching, dealing with gossip, trying to make her unconventional marriage work, that she hadn't fully considered how her choices might be affecting other women. The thought that her determination to forge her own path might be giving other women permission to do the same filled her with a sense of purpose that went beyond her individual circumstances. The last day of the school year arrived in mid-May, and Clara stood before her students with mixed emotions. She was exhausted from the pregnancy and ready for a break, but she'd also grown to love these children and would miss their daily presence in her life. "You've all worked so hard this year," she told them, "and I'm proud of every single one of you. You've learned to think critically, to ask questions, to challenge ideas respectfully. You've discovered that education isn't about memorization, but about understanding. And most importantly, you've learned that your thoughts and opinions matter." Little Sarah Hutchins, Harvey's daughter, who'd been so shy at the beginning of the year, raised her hand. Mrs. Forrester, will you come back to teach us after your baby is born?" Clara smiled, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I hope so, Sarah. Maybe not every day like I do now, but I'll be teaching at the new school on the ranch, and I hope to return here at least part-time. Teaching is part of who I am, and having a baby won't change that." My mother says it's not proper for a lady to work after she has children, one of the older boys said, not unkindly, just stating what he'd been told. There are lots of things people say aren't proper, Clara replied gently. But proper isn't the same as right or good or meaningful. Each of you will have to decide for yourselves what kind of life you want to live, what rules you'll follow, and which ones you'll question. My hope is that I've taught you to think for yourselves, to make choices based on your values rather than just doing what everyone expects. After the students had gone home for the summer, Clara remained in the empty classroom for a while, running her hand over the desks, remembering the victories and challenges of her first year. Tom Chen appeared in the doorway, holding a folder of papers. "Mrs. Forrester, I wanted you to see these before you left for the summer," he said, handing her the folder. "They're letters from parents about your teaching. I asked for feedback, partly because I wanted to assess your first year, and partly because I thought you might need the encouragement." Clara opened the folder and began reading. There were complaints, certainly, a few parents who still felt her methods were too unconventional or that she'd challenged their children too much. But overwhelmingly, the letters were positive. Parents wrote about children who'd discovered a love of learning, students who'd been struggling but were now thriving, daughters who'd begun to believe they could aspire to more than they'd previously imagined. One letter in particular caught Clara's eye. It was from a rancher named Samuel Morrison, whose daughter Beth was one of Clara's students. "My Beth has dyslexia," he'd written in careful script. The previous teacher said she was slow and would never amount to much. Mrs. Forrester spent extra time with Beth, figured out different ways to teach her, and never once made her feel stupid. This year, Beth read her first complete book. She cried when she finished it, and so did I. Mrs. Forrester gave my daughter the gift of believing in herself. I will be forever grateful. Clara had to sit down, overwhelmed by emotion. This was why she taught. This was why she'd fought so hard to continue working even after marriage. These children needed someone who saw their potential, who refused to give up on them, who believed that all minds were capable of brilliance if given the right tools and encouragement. 2 weeks later, on a warm June morning with the sun streaming through the ranch house windows, Clara went into labor. Eli was beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her through each contraction. Doc Pritchard attended the birth with Hattie assisting, and after 12 hours of labor, Clara brought a daughter into the world. The moment they placed the baby in her arms, Clara felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. The infant had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn gray like her father's. She was perfect, tiny and red-faced, and absolutely perfect. "What should we name her?" Clara asked Eli, who was staring at his daughter with an expression of wonder and terror and love all mixed together. "I was thinking," Eli said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "that maybe we could call her Hope. Hope Sarah Forrester, for the wife and daughter I lost, and for the future we're building together." Clara looked at her husband, seeing the tears streaming down his face, understanding the profound significance of the name. It honored the past while embracing the future. It acknowledged grief while celebrating new life. "Hope Sarah," Clara repeated, testing the name. "It's beautiful, Eli. It's perfect." Hattie, standing nearby with tears in her own eyes, said softly, "Sarah would have loved that, and she would have loved you both. This is a good thing you're doing, honoring her memory this way." The next months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. Hope was a fairly easy baby, content and curious, watching everything with those solemn gray eyes. Clara threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to teaching, reading every book on infant care she could find, and applying her analytical mind to understanding what Hope needed. But she also continued to be Clara, still reading, still thinking, still preparing for when she'd return to teaching. The ranch schoolhouse was completed in July, and Clara spent hours organizing it, setting up a curriculum that would serve children ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Word had spread about the school, and she already had commitments from 11 families who wanted to send their children when it opened in the fall. It was a warm August evening when Clara and Eli sat on the porch, Hope sleeping peacefully in a basket between them, and took stock of how far they'd come. "Do you remember," Clara said, "what you told me that day in the empty classroom in Juniper Springs? You said we'd prove everyone wrong. Everyone who said I'd be alone forever. Everyone who said you'd never move on from grief." I remember, Eli said, reaching over to take her hand. You were right, Clara continued. Look at us now. We have a daughter, a ranch, 2 schools where I can teach. We've built exactly the kind of marriage we wanted, one that doesn't follow anyone else's rules but works for us. It hasn't been easy, though, Eli said honestly. The gossip, the criticism, the judgment from people who think we're doing everything wrong. No, it hasn't been easy, Clara agreed. But it's been worth it. Every difficult moment, every judgment we've endured, every time we've had to defend our choices, it's been worth it because we're happy, Eli. Genuinely, deeply happy. And we're showing hope that there are different ways to build a life. The ranch school opened in September with 13 students ranging from age 6 to 14. Clara taught 3 days a week, with Hattie watching Hope while she worked. The other 2 weekdays, Clara devoted to being a mother and preparing lessons. It was exhausting, demanding work, but it filled her with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she'd never quite felt before. The students at the ranch school were different from her Juniper Springs pupils, rougher, less formally educated, many of them several years behind where they should have been academically. But they were also hungry to learn, grateful for the opportunity, and willing to work hard. Clara applied the same innovative teaching methods she'd used in town, and within weeks she began to see progress. One of her students was a 15-year-old boy named Jacob, the son of a neighboring rancher. He'd never been to school before because his family couldn't spare him for the long trip to town. He could barely read and couldn't write at all when he started. But Jacob had a brilliant mathematical mind, and once Clara discovered this, she found ways to build his confidence in math, while also teaching him literacy skills through books about ranching, agriculture, and business management, subjects that interested him. By Christmas, Jacob could read basic texts and was working on writing his first letter to a cousin back east. His father came to see Clara personally to thank her. My boy was convinced he was stupid, Mr. Peterson said, his voice gruff with emotion. All these years I thought maybe he was right, that some people just aren't meant for book learning. But you saw something in him that nobody else did. You taught him that being smart in different ways still counts as being smart. That's a gift, Mrs. Forrester. That's changing my son's life. In January, Clara received a letter from the Juniper Springs School Board asking if she'd be willing to return to teaching in town on a part-time basis. 2 of her former students had stopped coming to school regularly, saying that lessons weren't the same without Mrs. Forrester, and several parents had requested that she be brought back. The board proposed that Clara teach in town 2 days a week, focusing on literature and advanced studies for the older students, while another teacher handled the younger grades and basic instruction. Clara discussed the proposal with Eli that evening. It would mean even less time together during the week, and it would be challenging to balance 2 schools plus caring for Hope. But it was also an opportunity to reach more students and to prove that women could indeed balance multiple roles if given the support and flexibility to do so. What do you want to do? Eli asked, and Clara loved that his question wasn't about what made sense or what was practical, but simply about what she wanted. I want to try, Clara said. I want to see if I can make it work. But Eli, I can't do it without your support. I need to know that you're truly all right with me being gone even more, that you won't grow to resent the time I spend away from home. Eli pulled her into his arms, careful not to wake Hope, who was sleeping against Clara's shoulder. I married you knowing you were a teacher. That hasn't changed. Yes, I miss you when you're gone. Yes, there are moments when I wish things were simpler, but watching you teach, seeing you change children's lives, knowing you're doing exactly what you were meant to do, that makes me proud, Clara. I wouldn't want you to be anything other than who you are. So Clara returned to Juniper Springs 2 days a week, teaching her beloved literature classes and advanced studies while also maintaining her 3 days at the ranch school. It was exhausting, demanding work that required careful time management and an enormous amount of energy. There were days when Clara felt spread too thin, when she wondered if she was trying to do too much. But there were also moments of transcendent joy. Seeing a student's face light up with understanding, receiving grateful letters from parents, watching children who'd been told they were failures discover their own brilliance. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, she became a fixture at both schools. Clara would bring her daughter to the ranch school, where Hope would sit in the corner playing with blocks while Clara taught. The students adored the baby, often reading to her during breaks or helping watch her when Clara needed both hands for demonstrations. Hope's first words were book and school, which made both Clara and Eli laugh. The seasons turned, and slowly, grudgingly, the community's attitude toward the Foresters began to shift. It was hard to maintain disapproval in the face of Clara's obvious success as both teacher and mother. Even Mrs. Henderson, encountering Clara in the general store one day with Hope balanced on one hip and a stack of books under the other arm, had to admit, albeit grudgingly, that Clara seemed to be managing her unusual life quite well. "I still think it's irregular," Mrs. Henderson sniffed, "but I suppose if your husband is satisfied with the arrangement, it's none of my concern." "It's not about my husband being satisfied," Clara corrected gently but firmly. "It's about us being partners who support each other's callings. Eli doesn't give me permission to teach. I don't need permission. We make decisions together about what's best for our family." It was a small moment, barely worth noting, but for Clara it represented how far she'd come. A year ago, she would have been defensive, angry at the implied criticism. Now she could simply state the truth with confidence and move on. 2 years after Hope's birth, the Sullivans sent a letter from Oregon. They'd successfully made it west and established themselves. James had found work as a carpenter, and Mary, to Clara's delight, had begun illustrating for a local newspaper. They'd enclosed one of Mary's published drawings, a beautiful sketch of a frontier family, and Clara immediately had it framed and hung in her classroom. "This is what's possible when we refuse to accept limitations," she told her students, showing them the drawing. Mrs. Sullivan was told that wives shouldn't pursue art. She almost believed it, but she chose to define her own life instead, and now her work is published and admired. Each of you has that same choice, to accept what the world tells you you can or cannot be, or to forge your own path. In the spring of Hope's 3rd year, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with little fanfare or controversy. The community had adjusted to the Foresters' unconventional life, and Clara's pregnancy was simply acknowledged as a natural development. She continued teaching until a week before her due time, then welcomed a son into the world, a boy they named Samuel after Eli's father. With 2 children, Clara had to make adjustments. She reduced her time at the Juniper Springs School to 1 day a week, focusing her energy on the ranch school and her family. It was a difficult decision, but she'd learned that being a pioneer didn't mean being superhuman. It meant making thoughtful choices about where to direct her limited time and energy, and trusting that those choices didn't define her entire worth. The years continued to unfold, bringing both challenges and joys. The ranch prospered, allowing Eli to hire more hands and expand the cattle operation. The ranch school grew, eventually serving nearly 20 students from families throughout the region. Clara published several articles in education journals about her innovative teaching methods, and educators from other parts of the territory began writing to ask her advice. But more than professional success or community recognition, what mattered most to Clara and Eli was the family they'd built together. Hope grew into a curious, intelligent child who loved books as much as her mother did and showed an early aptitude for mathematics. Samuel was more like his father, quieter, more introspective, with a deep love for animals and the land. Together, the 4 of them created a home that was warm and chaotic and full of love. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Eli surprised Clara by taking her to the spot by the creek where he'd first proposed. The wildflowers were in bloom again, painting the banks in brilliant colors, and the evening light was soft and golden. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before I rode off with the marshal's posse?" Eli asked, taking Clara's hands in his. "I said I'd like many more of our conversations," Clara recalled with a smile. "And I want you to know we've had thousands of conversations since then, and I treasure every single one. The deep philosophical debates, the practical discussions about ranch management and curriculum planning, the silly arguments about whose turn it is to get up with the children, the quiet moments when we don't need words at all. Every conversation, every moment with you, Clara. It's exactly what I hoped for when I said forever starts with me." "Forever starts with us," Clara corrected, as she always did. "That's how it's always been, Eli. We built this together." She looked around at the landscape that had become home. The ranch buildings in the distance, the schoolhouse with smoke rising from its chimney, the prairie stretching endlessly under a vast sky. 5 years ago, she'd been a woman resigned to loneliness. convinced that her intelligence and independence meant she'd always be apart. Now she stood here with a husband who celebrated every part of who she was, with children who'd grow up believing that people could define their own paths, and with a sense of purpose that came from knowing her work mattered. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your wagon wheel hadn't broken?" Eli asked. "Never," Clara said firmly. "That broken wheel was the beginning of everything. It brought me to you, brought us to this life we've built. Sometimes I think it wasn't an accident at all. Maybe it was fate's way of saying that I'd traveled far enough alone, that it was time to find my partner." "Our children are going to grow up seeing a different kind of marriage," Eli observed. "One where both partners pursue their callings, where success isn't measured by adherence to convention, but by mutual respect and support. Do you think that will make their lives easier or harder?" Clara thought about it, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "Probably both. They'll face criticism from people who think we're raising them wrong, but they'll also have the confidence to be themselves, the courage to question limitations, and the understanding that love doesn't require anyone to be less than they are. That's worth any difficulty they might face." As they walked back to the ranch house, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd been called too educated, too opinionated, too independent, as if these were flaws rather than strengths. She'd been told she'd be alone forever, that no man would want a wife who challenged him intellectually or had ambitions beyond housekeeping. But Eli Forrester had looked at her and seen not someone who needed to be diminished, but someone worth celebrating exactly as she was. He'd offered partnership instead of possession, support instead of control. Together, they'd written their own story, one that defied convention and proved that love could take many forms. Now, as she watched Hope and Samuel playing in the yard while Hattie called them in for dinner, as she saw the lights of the schoolhouse where tomorrow she'd teach another generation of children to think for themselves, as she felt Eli's hand in hers and knew that after 5 years he still looked at her with the same wonder and respect he'd shown from the beginning, Clara understood that this was what forever looked like. It looked like choosing each other every day. It looked like supporting each other's dreams even when they complicated life. It looked like building something new because the old patterns didn't fit. It looked like courage and compromise and constant communication. Most of all, it looked like two people who'd both been told they'd be alone deciding to prove the world wrong together. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Clara sat down with the journal Eli had given her years ago. It was nearly full now, pages and pages of her experiences teaching, raising children, building a life that looked nothing like what she'd been told was possible. On a fresh page she wrote, "They said I'd be alone forever. They said I was too educated, too independent, too much. They said a woman like me would never find a man who could love all of who I am. And then a cowboy stopped to help me when my wagon broke down, and everything changed. Eli didn't see my intelligence as a threat or my ambitions as competition. He saw a partner, someone who could walk beside him rather than behind him. Together, we've built a life that honors both of us, our work, our family, our dreams. We've shown Hope and Samuel that love doesn't require diminishment, that partnership means elevation rather than limitation. And we've proven to everyone who doubted us that sometimes the best way to have a happy ending is to write your own story instead of following someone else's script. Forever didn't start with him or with me, it started with us. And it's still going, still growing, still surprising us with new possibilities. This is what happily ever after really looks like. Not perfect, not conventional, but real and rich, and exactly what we both needed." She closed the journal and joined Eli on the porch, where he was watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she was meant to be. Under that vast Colorado sky, with the prairie wind whispering through the grass and the promise of tomorrow stretching before them, Clara and Eli Forrester sat together in comfortable silence. They'd started with a broken wheel and a stranger's kindness. They'd built a partnership that defied convention and proved that love could honor both tradition and innovation. And they'd created a legacy that would ripple forward through their children and students, showing future generations that there were always more possibilities than the world wanted them to believe. Forever had indeed started with them, together. And it would continue day by day, choice by choice, conversation by conversation, for all the years to come. The end.